A 10-year-old boy walked 4 miles through freezing snow to ask a stranger where the police station was. Nobody helped him. Not the gas station clerk who saw him shivering outside the window. Not the woman in the SUV who slowed down, then kept driving. Not the off-duty deputy who told him to go home before dark. The only people who listened were the most dangerous men in the county, a brotherhood of scarred, broken bikers sitting inside a dying roadside diner, carrying more invisible wounds than the boy could ever understand. This is not a story about heroes. This is a story about what happens when the world abandons a child and the only ones left standing wear leather and ride thunder. If this story hits you, and it will, smash that like button, drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from, and stay until the very last word. Because what happens at the end of this story will stay with you long after the engines go silent. The diner had no name anymore. Whatever letters once hung above the door had been stolen years ago, leaving behind only rusted bolts and the pale ghost shapes of words bleached into the aluminum siding by decades of sun and winter. Locals called it Mac's, though nobody named Mac had worked there since the Clinton administration. The county had condemned its septic system twice. The health inspector visited once a year and left shaking his head. But the coffee was strong, the parking lot was big enough for 12 Harleys lined abreast, and the old woman behind the counter, Doris, 73, cigarette always burning in a cracked ceramic ashtray beside the register, never once asked anyone to leave. That was enough. Cade Mercer sat alone at the end of the counter, leather jacket dark with melted snow, both hands wrapped around a mug he hadn't touched in 20 minutes. The coffee was cold. He didn't care. He wasn't here for coffee. I was here because the motel room he'd been renting by the week smelled like mildew and old carpet cleaner, and the walls were thin enough to hear the couple next door arguing about money every night until 2 in the morning, and sometimes a man needed to sit somewhere that wasn't slowly poisoning his mind. Outside, Route 14 stretched flat and gray beneath a sky that couldn't decide between rain and snow. The asphalt was wet. The wind carried that particular Midwest cold that didn't just bite. It settled into your bones like a squatter who had no intention of leaving. 3 Harleys sat in the parking lot, engines still ticking as they cooled, chrome catching the sick yellow pulse of the diner's one surviving neon sign. Cade was 41 years old and looked 50. Not because life had been unkind to his face, though it had, but because his eyes carried the kind of distance that aged a man from the inside out. Gray threaded through his dark hair at the temples. A scar split his left eyebrow where a bottle had caught him in a bar fight 7 years ago. His knuckles were permanently swollen, the skin across them white and tight like old leather stretched too far. He had a tattoo on his right forearm, a single word in block letters, still. People asked what it meant. He never answered. Behind him, 2 of his brothers occupied the corner booth. Roach, real name Dennis Kowalski, sat with his back to the wall because he hadn't sat with his back to a room since Fallujah. He was 56, thin as a fence post, with a beard that had gone completely white and hands that shook unless he was holding something. A wrench. A cigarette. The handlebar of his '98 Road King. The shaking had started 3 years ago. The VA said it was neurological. Roach said it was just his body finally catching up to what his mind had been doing since 2004. Beside him sat a man everyone called Dutch, though his birth certificate read Miguel Espinoza. Dutch was wide-shouldered, quiet, and had a face that looked like it had been carved out of sandstone by someone who got bored halfway through. He'd done 4 years in Leavenworth for assault, a fight he still maintained the other guy started, which was technically true. Though Dutch had ended it so thoroughly that the prosecutors used the word excessive 9 times during the trial. He'd been out for 6 years now, worked part-time at an auto salvage yard, read paperback westerns in his bunk at the clubhouse, said maybe 40 words on a good day. These were not good men by any standard the world respected. They paid taxes late or not at all. They drank too much. They'd all seen the inside of a holding cell at least once. 2 of them carried felony records that closed more doors than they'd ever be able to count. But they also knew things that respectable people didn't. They knew what a fist sounded like hitting a wall at 3 in the morning when a child was trying to sleep on the other side of it. They knew what it looked like when a woman smiled too quickly to cover a bruise. They knew the exact silence that filled a house after violence. Not peace, but the terrible, pressurized quiet of people waiting for the next explosion. They knew because they'd all grown up in that silence. The evening was dying. Doris was wiping down tables that didn't need wiping, moving through the empty diner like a ghost, tending a museum. Country music drifted from a radio so old its casing had yellowed to the color of old teeth. Outside, the temperature dropped another 3 degrees and the rain finally surrendered to snow. Fat, wet flakes that melted the instant they touched the blacktop but stuck to everything else. That was when the door opened. No bell. The bell had fallen off the door sometime during the Bush administration, and Doris had never replaced it. Just the sound of wind rushing in, carrying snow and road grit, and the smell of frozen earth, and then the sound of the door pulling shut against the pneumatic closer that wheezed like a dying accordion. Cade didn't look up immediately. He'd trained himself out of that reflex years ago. In his world, the wrong glance at the wrong moment could start something that ended in blood. He looked at the counter first, then the reflection in the chrome napkin dispenser. Then, slowly, casually, like a man who had all the time and none of the interest, he turned his head. A boy stood just inside the door, small, maybe 10 years old, maybe younger. It was hard to tell because the kid was wearing a sweatshirt 3 sizes too big, the hood pulled up, the cuffs hanging past his fingers like he was drowning in it. His jeans were wet from the knees down. His sneakers, cheap, off-brand, the kind you'd find in a bin at a discount store, were soaked through. He stood perfectly still. That was the first thing Cade noticed. Not the size of the kid, not the wet clothes, not even the bruise that came later. It was the stillness. Children didn't stand like that. Children fidgeted, shifted weight, looked around, touched things. This boy stood the way men stood in prison yards. Weight balanced, shoulders drawn in, eyes scanning without moving his head. It was a posture designed for one purpose, to occupy as little space as possible while monitoring every potential threat in the room. Cade had spent 18 years around broken men, addicts, drifters, veterans carrying wars inside their skulls that the rest of the country had already forgotten. He'd seen every shade of damage the human body and mind could absorb and still keep walking. He recognized survival when he saw it. Doris noticed the boy before anyone spoke. She came around the counter with that particular combination of concern and practiced distance that women in small towns develop after decades of seeing things they couldn't fix. "Sweetheart, you okay? You need to use the phone?" The boy looked at her, then looked past her, at the bikers. His eyes moved from Cade to Roach to Dutch and back again. Measuring, calculating. Not with the innocent curiosity of a child, but with the cold, quiet arithmetic of someone who'd learned to assess danger before he'd learned to read. "Can you tell me where the police station is?" The words came out flat, rehearsed, like he'd been saying them inside his head for 4 miles, polishing each syllable until the fear was sanded off and only the question remained. Every man at the booth stopped moving. Roach's coffee mug froze halfway to his lips. Dutch's hand went still on the table. Cade felt something shift in the room. Not a sound, not a movement, but a change in atmospheric pressure, the way the air changes before a storm actually breaks. Doris started to answer. She was pointing toward the west end of town, already explaining the route. 2 lights, left on Birch. You'll see it on the right. When Cade spoke. "Why?" One word, quiet. Not a demand, not even really a question, more like a door being held open. The boy looked at him. The bruise was visible now, dark purple along the left side of his jaw, creeping up toward his cheekbone. Fresh. Maybe 6 hours old. The kind of bruise that comes from a closed fist hitting a face that hasn't finished growing yet. The boy didn't answer immediately. He was deciding. Cade could see it, the gears turning behind those dark, watchful eyes. Trust was a currency this kid had been bankrupted on a long time ago, and he was calculating whether this scarred stranger in a leather jacket was worth the investment. Cade didn't push, didn't lean forward, didn't soften his voice or offer comfort. He just waited, kept his hands visible on the counter, let the silence do its work. Then the boy spoke again, and the temperature inside the diner dropped 10 degrees. "My brother's still in the house." Doris's hand went to her mouth. Behind Cade, he heard the soft creak of booth leather as Roach slowly sat up straight. Dutch set both palms flat on the table, a gesture so controlled it was almost mechanical, like a man physically preventing himself from standing up too fast. Cade nodded once. "Sit down." The boy hesitated. "There's hot chocolate," Cade said. And the seat's warm. You've been walking a while. It wasn't a guess. The kid's sneakers were soaked through. His lips had a blue tinge. His hands, still hidden inside the sweatshirt cuffs, were trembling, though whether from cold or adrenaline or both was impossible to tell. The boy sat, 3 stools down from Cade, close enough to hear, far enough to run. Cade noticed that too. Doris brought the hot chocolate without being asked. She set it down gently, the way you set something down near an animal you don't want to startle, and retreated behind the counter without a word. The mug sat there steaming while the boy stared at it like he was trying to remember the last time someone had given him something warm without wanting something back. The story came out in fragments. Not a narrative, fragments. The way trauma always emerged. Not beginning to end, but in jagged pieces, the worst parts surfacing first because those were the ones the mind couldn't hold underwater anymore. His name was Eli. His brother was Noah. Noah was 7. Their mother was Lena. The man in the house was Roy Vance. He wasn't their father. Their father had left when Noah was still in diapers. Roy had been around for 2 years. The first year was okay. The second year was not. Roy drank. That was the simple version. The complicated version was that Roy drank and became someone else. Someone whose hands moved faster than his voice, whose temper had no logic, whose rages could be triggered by a television volume, a dish left in the sink, a child's laughter at the wrong moment. He never hit their mother where people could see. Never hit the boys where teachers would ask questions. He knew the geography of abuse. Which parts of the body hid bruises, which rooms in the house muffled sound, which hours of the night were dark enough that no neighbor would notice. Eli spoke about this the way a mechanic described an engine, technically, precisely, without emotion. He'd learned the vocabulary of survival so thoroughly that the feelings had been compressed into something small and hard, like a stone in his chest he carried everywhere but never acknowledged. "Why didn't your mom call the police?" Roach asked from the booth. His voice was raspy. Careful. The voice of a man who already knew the answer but needed to hear it anyway. Eli looked at him. "She did. Twice." Silence. First time, they talked to Roy on the porch. He said everything was fine. Mom said everything was fine. They left. And the second time? Roy told them Mom was on medication, that she made things up. They believed him. The mug of hot chocolate still sat untouched. Steam curled upward in the diner's yellow light, disappearing into the haze of Doris's cigarette smoke. Cade felt something old and familiar moving through him, a dark current that started in his stomach and radiated outward through his chest and arms. Not anger exactly. Anger was loud. This was quieter. This was the thing that lived underneath anger, in the basement of a man's soul where the most dangerous decisions were made in perfect silence. He knew this feeling because he'd felt it before. When he was 10 years old, when he was the boy standing in a stranger's doorway with a bruise on his face and a secret too heavy for his bones. Nobody had helped him then. "Where's the house?" Dutch asked. 3 words. His first in over an hour. Eli told them. Briar Lane, number 412. A gray house with a rusted basketball hoop in the driveway and a porch light that was always on because Roy liked to see who was coming up the walk. Dutch nodded once, pulled out his phone, and typed the address into the map. Then he slid the phone across the table to Roach without looking up. Roach glanced at the screen, put the phone down, finished his coffee in one swallow. No words were exchanged, no vote was taken, no discussion was needed. Cade had been riding with these men for 11 years. They'd buried friends together. They'd broken bones together. They'd sat in hospital waiting rooms and courtrooms and the parking lots of funeral homes together. Communication between them had been distilled over the years into something that operated below language. A system of glances, gestures, and silences that carried more information than most people packed into full conversations. What happened in the next 30 seconds was this. Roach stood up, Dutch stood up. Both men walked to the door. Roach held it open while Dutch stepped out into the snow. Then Roach looked back at Cade and gave him the shortest nod in the history of human communication. "We're going." Cade looked at Eli. The boy was watching the bikers with an expression Cade couldn't immediately name. Not hope. The kid had been burned out of that long ago. Not fear either. Something between the two. Something like the expression of a man lost at sea who sees a shape on the horizon and can't yet tell if it's a ship or a storm. "You want to stay here with Doris? or you want to come? It wasn't really a question. Cade knew which one the boy would choose before the words left his mouth. I'm coming. Outside, the snow was falling harder now. The parking lot had gone white. The three Harleys sat under a growing blanket of flakes, chrome and black metal disappearing beneath powder. The neon sign buzzed and flickered, a dying heartbeat of pink and blue light that painted the falling snow in colors that shouldn't have existed in a place this tired and forgotten. Cade zipped his jacket, pulled on his gloves, threw a leg over the Heritage Softail, and felt the cold leather of the seat bite through his jeans. The engine caught on the first kick, a deep, rumbling bass note that vibrated through his chest and rattled the diner's windows. Beside him, Roach and Dutch brought their machines to life in sequence, and for a moment the parking lot was filled with the kind of thunder that made the ground feel unsteady beneath your feet. Eli stood at the edge of the lot, snow collecting on his hood, watching. Get on, Cade said. Hold the seat rail behind you. Don't lean. Don't grab. The boy climbed on without hesitation. His weight was nothing, 60 pounds, maybe 70, and Cade felt him settle onto the pillion like a bird landing on a wire. He reached back instinctively to check that the kid was secure, and his hand found Eli's fingers gripping the very edge of the seat rail. Not Cade's jacket, not his belt, the edge of the seat. The boy had positioned himself as far from physical contact as the motorcycle physically allowed while still being on it. Cade stared straight ahead at the falling snow. He didn't trust his voice, he didn't trust his face. So he twisted the throttle and pulled out of the lot, and the cold wind hit them both like a wall of glass. They rode through town in formation, Cade at point, Roach and Dutch flanking, three black machines moving through the white streets like a funeral procession for something that hadn't died yet. The streetlights were the old sodium kind, casting everything in that sickly orange glow that made every surface look contaminated. Houses slid past on both sides, dark windows, snow-covered lawns, the occasional blue flicker of a television behind curtains. A dog barked somewhere in the distance and was swallowed by the sound of the engines. Eli didn't speak, didn't point. Cade followed the map on instinct, the route already memorized from Dutch's phone. Left on Birch, right on Elm, straight through the dead intersection where the traffic light swung on its cable like a hanged man in the wind. Then Briar Lane. The street was narrow, residential, the kind of neighborhood that looked decent enough during the day, but turned hollow at night. Porches with no furniture, driveways with cars that hadn't moved in months, windows where curtains stayed closed, not for privacy, but for concealment. Cade had grown up on a street like this. He knew the architecture of quiet desperation the way a sailor knew the smell of a coming storm. Number 412 was exactly as Eli described. Gray siding, rusted basketball hoop nailed above the garage door at an angle that suggested it had been installed by someone who didn't own a level. Porch light on, bright, almost aggressive, throwing a cone of white light across the snow-covered front steps. Danger never looked cinematic from the outside. That was the thing people didn't understand. They expected peeling paint, broken windows, trash in the yard. But the worst things Cade had ever seen happened inside houses that looked exactly like this one, maintained just enough to pass a glance from the road, neglected just enough that anyone paying real attention would feel the wrongness settling into their teeth like a cavity. He killed the engine at the curb. Roach and Dutch pulled up behind him and did the same. The sudden silence was enormous, a pressure change like surfacing from deep water. Snow hissed against warm metal. A gutter dripped somewhere in the dark. Stay here, Cade said to Eli. The boy's eyes went wide. For the first time, something cracked through the careful blankness of his expression. He'll know someone told. He won't touch your brother again. You understand me? Cade said it the way he said everything, quietly, flatly, without decoration. But something in the words carried a weight that made Eli go still. Not the stillness of fear this time, the stillness of recognition. The boy heard something in Cade's voice that he understood at a molecular level because it was the same frequency his own pain operated on. A damaged man making a promise to a damaged child, and both of them knowing the currency it was made in. Cade walked up the driveway. His boots crunched on the thin layer of fresh snow. Behind him, not beside him, not ahead of him, behind him, because they knew, Roach and Dutch fanned out toward opposite sides of the property. No signal, no communication. Muscle memory from years of moving together, reading each other's body language the way wolves read the shift of weight before a hunt begins. The porch steps creaked under Cade's weight. He stood in front of the door. The light was too bright. It turned his shadow into something sharp and elongated against the snow, like a blade laid across the yard. He knocked. 3 times. Steady. Not aggressive, not gentle. The knock of someone who expected the door to open and was prepared for whatever stood behind it. Inside, a television went quiet. Footsteps. Heavy. The particular cadence of a large man moving through a small space, the floor protesting under each step, a chair scraping, something being set down on a table. The door opened. Roy Vance was bigger than Cade expected. 6'2", maybe 6'3", with the kind of build that comes from manual labor, maintained by cheap beer. Thick through the chest and shoulders, soft through the middle, hands like slabs of raw meat. His face was red. Not from cold. From the inside out. The permanent flush of a man whose blood pressure and temper were in constant competition to see which one would kill him first. He looked at Cade. Looked past him at the motorcycles parked at the curb. Looked back. "Help you?" The voice was calm, controlled. The voice of a man who understood that the front door was a stage and the neighborhood was always watching. "Just checking on things," Cade said. Same flat tone. Same even cadence. 2 dangerous men measuring each other across a threshold while snow fell silently behind them and the porch light hummed like a live wire. Roy's eyes narrowed. Checking on what? The boy. Something shifted in Roy's face. Not much. A micro-expression. The slightest tightening of the jaw. The barely perceptible dilation of the pupils. Most people wouldn't have caught it. Cade caught it the way a seismograph catches a tremor 300 miles from the epicenter. What boy? My kids are in bed. It's 7:30. They go to bed early. School night. The lie was smooth, practiced. Roy Vance had been lying to authority figures his entire adult life. Landlords, probation officers, emergency room nurses, social workers, police. He'd polished his deception the way some men polish their cars, with obsessive, repetitive attention to surface and shine. But Cade wasn't an authority figure. I wasn't asking questions he didn't already know the answers to. He wasn't here to investigate. He was here to stand on this porch and look into this man's eyes and communicate, without a single explicit word, that the architecture of Roy Vance's hidden world had just been breached. I'd like to see Noah. Roy's hand tightened on the door frame. His knuckles went white. Behind the calm mask, something was moving, something Cade recognized because he'd spent his life around men who carried violence the way other men carried wallets. It was always there, always accessible, and the moment it surfaced, you could see it in the hands first. You don't know my kid's name, you don't know anything about my family, so I'm going to ask you to get off my porch before I... Then Noah appeared. He came from somewhere behind Roy, a hallway, a doorway, the dark interior of a house that probably hadn't had all its lights on at the same time in months. Small, 7 years old, but he looked younger. Pale in the way children get when they spend too much time indoors under artificial light. Wearing a t-shirt too thin for the weather that leaked through the open door. He stood behind Roy the way the moon stands behind the earth. Partially eclipsed, visible only at the edges, gravity locked to a body that controlled his orbit completely. Then Roy's hand moved. Not a strike, not a push, just a touch. His hand settling onto Noah's shoulder with the casual possessiveness of a man adjusting a piece of furniture. Light, almost gentle. And Noah flinched. The flinch was involuntary. Whole body. A full system response that started in his shoulders and cascaded down through his spine and legs like an electrical current. It lasted less than a second. But it said everything that Roy's careful words and controlled face had spent years trying to hide. That flinch was a confession written in the language of a child's nervous system. Cade felt the current hit, not in his fists, in his chest. A deep seismic crack that ran through the center of him like a fault line splitting open, and underneath it was not rage but something older and heavier, the 10-year-old version of himself standing in a different doorway, wearing a different bruise, waiting for someone. Anyone, to see what was happening and decide it mattered. Nobody had come for him. He'd promised himself in the years since that if the moment ever arrived, if he ever stood on the other side of that door, He would not be the one who walked away. Behind Roy, the hallway was dark. The house breathed out the smell of stale beer and dish soap and something burnt. The television in the living room was silent but still glowing, blue light pulsing against the walls like the heartbeat of something sick. And from the curb, Cade heard Eli's voice, thin, sharp, cutting through the snow and silence like a wire pulled taut. "Noah, come here." Roy turned. That was his mistake. He took his eyes off Cade and looked toward the street, toward the boys standing beside the motorcycles. And in that fraction of a second, the dynamic on the porch shifted irreversibly. Noah moved, not fast. Children who live in fear don't move fast. They move carefully, strategically, the way prisoners move through spaces controlled by someone bigger. He slid sideways, out from under Roy's hand, along the wall of the hallway, toward the open door. His eyes never left Roy's back. His feet made no sound on the floor. Roy spun back, his hand reached, and Cade was there. Not between them exactly. Cade hadn't moved from his position on the porch, but his presence expanded, filled the doorway completely, became a wall of leather and scarred knuckles and absolute immovable stillness. He didn't raise a hand, didn't speak, didn't need to. The message was delivered through posture alone. The next hand that touches this child will not be withdrawn intact. Roy stopped. The two men stood there, inches apart, breath visible in the cold air between them, the porch light turning them both into sharp-edged silhouettes against the falling snow. The moment stretched, held, vibrated with a tension so acute that the air itself seemed to hum. Then Noah broke free. He came through the door sideways, small body slipping past both men like water through a crack in a dam, and ran, truly ran, the first uncontrolled movement Cade had seen from either child, down the porch steps, across the snow-covered driveway, and into his brother's arms. Eli caught him, held him, didn't speak. From the corner of the property, Roach stepped into the porch light's reach. From the other side, Dutch materialized from the shadows near the garage. Neither man said a word. They simply stood, two weathered figures in black leather, positioned with the unconscious precision of men who had spent years understanding perimeters and sight lines and the geometry of controlled spaces. Roy looked at Cade, looked at the men flanking his house, looked at the two boys holding each other at the curb. His face went through a series of rapid calculations. Fury, assessment, strategy, fear. The last one won. Not because Roy Vance was a coward, but because he was a predator, and predators survived by recognizing when the mathematics of violence had shifted against them. "You have no idea what you just did," Roy said quietly. Cade looked at him, held his gaze. Let 3 full seconds of silence pass, enough time for the words to land, settle, and reveal themselves as exactly what they were. The threat of a man who had just lost control of everything and was reaching for the only tool he had left. "Yeah," Cade said. "I do." Then from inside the dark house, a woman's voice. "Eli? Baby?" Cade turned toward the sound. In the hallway, half hidden by shadows, a woman stood gripping the wall with both hands. Thin, dark-haired, wearing a bathrobe that hung off her frame like it belonged to someone who used to be larger. Her face was the map of a country that had been at war with itself for years. Exhaustion, fear, and something else. Something Cade almost didn't recognize because he'd seen it so rarely in places like this. Hope. But it was fragile, newborn, the kind of hope that could be killed by a single wrong word. Roy turned toward her. "Lena, get back inside." She didn't move, and Cade realized, watching her fingers tighten against the wall, that the most dangerous moment of the night had not yet arrived. Because the question of whether Lena would walk through that door or retreat back into the dark house behind the man who controlled her was a question that no one in this driveway, no matter how scarred or strong, could answer for her. The snow fell harder. The porch light flickered once, a brief, stuttering interruption that plunged everything into darkness for half a second before snapping back. And somewhere in the distance, too far away to help but close enough to hear, the sound of a police siren cut through the frozen night like a blade. The siren died 2 blocks away. Not the gradual fade of a cruiser passing through, the abrupt, mechanical cut of someone killing the sound on purpose. The light stayed on. Cade could see the red and blue pulse reflecting off snow-covered rooftops at the end of Briar Lane, painting the low winter clouds in sick, rhythmic color. Someone had called. Maybe a neighbor. Maybe Doris from the diner doing what Doris always did, watching, waiting, then quietly dialing the number she kept taped to the register beside the health inspector's citation and the faded photo of her dead husband. Maybe it didn't matter who called. What mattered was the cruiser rolling slowly up Briar Lane with its headlights cutting through the snowfall like surgical instruments, and Roy Vance still standing on that porch with his hand braced against the doorframe and his face cycling through expressions that had nothing to do with cooperation. Cade stepped back. One step. Deliberate. Not retreat. Clearance. The kind of space you create when you know a situation is about to acquire witnesses and you want the geometry clean. Lena, he said, not turning around, his voice pitched low enough that Roy couldn't hear it over the approaching engine. You've got about 45 seconds. She didn't answer, but he heard her breathing change, a small sharp intake that told him she understood exactly what 45 seconds meant. It meant the window between Roy's attention being divided and the officers reaching the porch. It meant the distance between the hallway where she stood and the front door was exactly 12 feet, and those 12 feet were the longest journey she would ever take. The cruiser stopped at the curb behind the Harleys. 2 officers. Cade recognized the type immediately. Small-town cops, the kind who handled domestic calls the way most people handled flat tires. Annoying. Routine. Something to get through as fast as possible so they could go back to whatever they were doing before the radio interrupted. The driver was young, late 20s, clean-shaven, gym-built, wearing his authority like a new jacket he hadn't broken in yet. His partner was older, mid-40s, heavy through the middle, with the particular weariness of a man who'd answered the same calls in the same neighborhoods for 20 years and stopped believing any of it would change. The young one approached first. His hand was on his belt, not his weapon, but close enough to communicate the suggestion. His eyes moved across the scene with the rehearsed alertness of someone who'd been trained to see threats but not yet experienced enough to see people. "Someone want to tell me what's going on here?" Roy answered before anyone else could. He came down the porch steps, casual, controlled, his body language shifting so fast it would have been impressive if it weren't nauseating. The menace evaporated. The tension in his jaw dissolved. He became, in the span of 3 seconds, a concerned homeowner in a plaid shirt, slightly confused, mildly annoyed, perfectly cooperative. "Officer, I honestly have no idea. These guys showed up on my porch about 10 minutes ago. I've never seen them before in my life. I think they've got the wrong house." Smooth, clean, delivered with the precise calibration of a man who had rehearsed this exact performance for exactly this kind of audience. Cade watched it happen and felt something cold move through his chest. Not surprise, but recognition. He'd seen this act before. Every abuser had one. The public self. The mask that fit so well that most people couldn't tell it was a mask at all. The older officer looked at the Harleys, looked at Cade, looked at the 2 boys standing at the curb, Eli still holding Noah, Noah's face buried in his brother's sweatshirt. The officer's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes shifted, a gear turning, a file opening. "Those your kids?" he asked Roy. "My girlfriend's kids. They're fine. Probably just came outside when they heard the bikes." "In the snow? No coats?" Roy shrugged, one shoulder, casual. "Kids." Cade felt Roach move behind him. Not forward, just a shift of weight, the particular redistribution of a man who was physically preventing himself from speaking. Roach had a temper that ran cold, not hot. He didn't explode. He calculated. And right now, Cade knew Roach was calculating the exact number of ways this conversation could go wrong and finding the number unacceptable. The young officer turned to Cade. "Sir, can I see some ID?" "Sure." Cade reached into his jacket slowly, movements visible, controlled, the practiced choreography of a man who'd been asked for identification by law enforcement more times than he could count and understood that the speed of your hands determined whether the next 5 minutes were polite or violent. He produced his license, handed it over. The officer studied it, looked at the name, looked at Cade's face, looked at the scar above his eye and the tattoo on his forearm and the leather and the road grime, and made every assumption that leather and road grime invited. "Cade Mercer. You live around here?" "Passing through." "Passing through to where?" "Wherever the road goes." The young officer's jaw tightened. He didn't like that answer. It was the kind of answer that men in uniform interpreted as defiance, even when it was just the truth. You want to tell me why you're on this man's property at 8 o'clock at night in a snowstorm? Cade looked at Roy. Roy looked back. Two men locked in a silent negotiation that the officers couldn't see. A conversation conducted entirely in the space between words, where the real language lived. The boy asked for help, Cade said. What boy? Cade tilted his head toward the curb. The one with the bruise on his face. Silence. The snowfall seemed to thicken in that silence, as if the weather itself was holding its breath. The young officer looked at Eli. From this distance, under the sodium streetlight, the bruise on Eli's jaw was unmistakable, a dark bloom against pale skin that no amount of explanation could make innocent. The older officer took a step closer to the boys, squatted down. His knees cracked loud enough to hear from the porch. He looked at Noah first, then Eli. He didn't speak immediately. He just looked, the way someone looks at a photograph they've seen too many times. The composition familiar, the details exhausting. Son, can you tell me your name? Eli's voice was steady, flat, that same rehearsed quality. Eli Marsden. And this is your brother? Noah. Where's your mom? Eli pointed at the house. The older officer's gaze tracked the gesture to the front door, still open, the hallway still dark, and for a moment his face showed something that his 20 years of professional detachment couldn't quite suppress. Not shock. Confirmation. The face of a man who'd known, the second he turned onto Briar Lane, exactly what kind of call this was. He stood up, walked toward the porch. Roy was already talking, already filling the air with words designed to crowd out any space where the truth might fit. Something about the boys being dramatic, something about Eli falling off his bike last week, something about Lena's medication and her moods and how he'd been trying his best. He really had, but you know how it is with someone else's kids. I'd like to speak with the boy's mother, the older officer said. It wasn't a question, but it also wasn't, Cade noticed, a command. It was a request. Polite, deferential even. The language of a system that had been trained to ask permission at the threshold of a house where permission was never free. Roy didn't blink. She's asleep. She takes something at night, knocks her right out. I'd still like to speak with her. I can have her call the station tomorrow. Tonight would be better. The standoff lasted exactly 4 seconds. Cade counted. He counted because those 4 seconds contained a decision that would determine whether this night ended with paperwork or with something else, something the officers' training manuals described in neutral, procedural language that had nothing to do with the reality of what was happening inside that gray house. Roy smiled. The smile was the worst thing Cade had seen all night. Worse than the bruise, worse than Noah's flinch, worse than the dark hallway that exhaled the smell of stale beer and fear. It was a smile of total confidence. The smile of a man who had done this before, who had stood on this porch before, who had performed this exact routine for different officers wearing the same uniforms and watched them leave every single time. Of course, Roy said. Let me go get her. He turned and walked into the house. The door closed. Cade's entire body went rigid. Beside the garage, Dutch took one step forward. Instinctive, immediate, a reaction so visceral it bypassed every layer of self-control the man possessed. Roach's hand closed into a fist at his side. The young officer noticed. Sir, I'm going to need you and your friends to step back to the street. He just closed the door, Cade said. I'm aware of that. He's in there with her, alone. Sir, I understand your concern, but this is a domestic situation, and we need to follow. You've been here before. The words came from the older officer, not directed at Cade, directed at his partner. Quiet, the kind of quiet that carried weight. The young officer looked at him. Something passed between them. A communication as silent and loaded as the ones that passed between Cade and his brothers, but encoded in a different language. The language of badge numbers and incident reports, and the particular guilt that accumulates when a system fails the same people twice. Dispatch, this is Unit 7, the older officer said into his radio. I need a supervisor at 412 Briar Lane, possible domestic, requesting backup. The radio crackled. A voice responded, flat, procedural, the audio equivalent of a form being filled out. And send county, the older officer added. We might need children's services. Roy's front door stayed closed. Behind the curtains, shadows moved. Too fast, too purposeful. The porch light caught the edge of something shifting inside, and Cade could hear faintly the muffled percussion of a voice speaking rapidly behind walls that were never thick enough. 2 minutes passed. Then 3. The snow was accumulating on everything now. The officers' hats, the hoods of the motorcycles, the shoulders of Dutch's leather jacket. As he stood motionless near the garage like a statue someone had forgotten to bring indoors. Eli and Noah sat in the back of the cruiser, not detained, just warm. The younger officer had opened the door and offered the back seat the way you'd offer a chair. Noah had climbed in immediately. Eli had hesitated, looking at Cade first, waiting for something. A nod, a signal, permission, before following his brother. That hesitation cost Cade something he couldn't name. A kid who trusted a stranger in leather more than a cop in uniform. That wasn't a compliment. That was an indictment of everything that had happened before this night. The front door opened again. Roy stepped out first. Behind him, Lena. She moved slowly. Each step was a negotiation. With her body, with her fear, with the invisible architecture of control that Roy had built around her over 2 years of calibrated violence. She wore the bathrobe Cade had seen earlier, cinched tight at the waist. Her hair was pulled back. Her face was composed, carefully, deliberately, the way a broken plate is composed when someone glues the pieces back together and hopes the cracks don't show. She stopped at the edge of the porch, looked at the officers, looked at the motorcycles, looked at the back of the cruiser where her boys sat watching her through glass fogged with their own breathing. She didn't cry. She was beyond crying. Crying was something you did when pain was intermittent, when it arrived and left, when it surprised you. Lena's pain was atmospheric. It was the air she breathed. You don't cry about air. Ma'am, I'm Officer Hale. This is Officer Drummond. We've received a concern about the welfare of your children. Can we speak with you? Lena nodded, a small motion, mechanical. Her eyes were on the cruiser. Roy stood behind her, close, not touching, but close enough that his presence was a physical pressure, a gravity field that bent everything around it. He had his arms crossed over his chest, the posture of an innocent man with nothing to hide. And Cade wanted to break every bone in those folded arms because the posture was a lie, and the innocence was a weapon, and the man was standing 3 feet behind a woman whose jaw held a bruise that makeup couldn't reach. But Cade had been forced to learn, in the years since his own fists had cost him 2 arrests and 1 night in the ICU with a ruptured spleen, that violence was a door that only opened in one direction. Once you walked through it, you couldn't walk back, and the people who needed you most were always standing on the other side. Officer Hale, the older one, took Lena aside, gently, positioned himself between her and Roy with the casual expertise of someone who'd done this before. His body language shifted, softer, lower, less official. He leaned in slightly when he spoke, gave her space, didn't touch her. Cade couldn't hear the conversation, but he could read the body language like a book written in a language he'd been fluent in since childhood. The careful questions, the even more careful pauses. The way Hale waited after each question, giving Lena time not just to answer, but to decide whether she wanted to. Roy watched from the porch. His face was calm, his hands were steady, but his eyes were doing something his face couldn't hide. They were tracking Lena's mouth with the intensity of a man reading lips, trying to determine, from 20 feet away through falling snow, exactly what she was saying and to whom and whether the architecture of his control was finally showing cracks. Cade lit a cigarette. The match flared orange in the white world, a small, brief violence of heat and sulfur, and the smoke rose thin and blue into the freezing air. He smoked the way he did everything, slowly, deliberately, without wasted motion. Roach came and stood beside him, didn't speak, just stood there, the way brothers stand beside each other when words would only get in the way of what needed to happen next. "She won't talk," Roach said finally. "Maybe. I've seen this. 100 times. She'll cover for him." "She might." "Cade." Roach's voice dropped. Not anger, something harder, urgency. "If she covers for him, those boys go back inside that house tonight. You understand that? The cops file a report. Social services opens a case. And in 3 to 6 months, somebody with a clipboard shows up and asks Roy Vance if everything's okay, and Roy Vance smiles that smile and says, 'Yes, ma'am, everything's fine,' and the file gets closed. That's how this works. You know that." Cade knew. He knew because it had happened to him. Not once, 3 times. 3 case files with 3 different social workers who each wrote some version of Home Appears Stable, because Roy Vance's equivalent in Cade's childhood, a man named Gary, whose last name Cade had spent years trying to forget and never quite could, had been just as smooth, just as practiced, just as devastatingly competent at the performance of normalcy. "She'll talk," Cade had said. "How do you know?" "Because she came to the door." Roach looked at him. "He told her to stay inside. She came anyway. You don't walk through a door that your jailer told you to stay behind unless something inside you already decided." Roach considered this, smoked, said nothing. In the distance, another siren. Backup, probably, the supervisor Hale had requested. The neighborhood was waking up now, porch lights clicking on one by one down the street like a slow cascade of reluctant attention, curtains parting, faces appearing in windows, pale and anonymous, watching the tableau on Briar Lane with the detached fascination of people who would discuss it tomorrow at the gas station but wouldn't testify about it next month at the courthouse. Then it happened. Lena stopped talking to Officer Hale, stopped mid-sentence from what Cade could see, her mouth open, her hands frozen in a gesture that was reaching for something her words couldn't quite carry. She turned and looked at the cruiser, at the window where Eli's face pressed against the glass, breath fogging and clearing, like a heartbeat made visible. She looked at her son for a long time. Then she started again. And this time her hands moved differently, faster. Her voice, Cade could hear fragments now, carried on the wind in broken syllables, rose. Not louder, sharper. The voice of a woman who had just made a decision that would dismantle every survival mechanism she'd built over 2 years and leave her standing in the wreckage with nothing but the truth. Officer Hale's posture changed, subtly. A slight straightening of the spine, a hand moving to his radio. He didn't interrupt, didn't write. Just listened with the focused attention of a man who understood that what he was hearing was not a statement, but a demolition. A woman taking a sledgehammer to the prison she'd been living in, one sentence at a time. Roy saw it too. He came off the porch. 2 steps. Fast. His mask slipped. Not all the way, but enough. The calm homeowner disappeared, and underneath was something raw and cornered and dangerous. The way a dog gets dangerous when it realizes the leash has been cut. "Lena! Lena, come on, we talked about this." Officer Drummond stepped into his path. Young, gym-built, authority like a new jacket. But in that moment, the jacket fit. "Sir, I need you to stay on the porch." "That's my house. Those are, sir, the porch." Roy looked at Drummond, looked at Lena, looked at Cade, who stood 15 feet away, cigarette between his fingers, snow on his shoulders, watching everything with the patient, unblinking attention of a man who had been waiting for this exact moment without knowing he was waiting for it. Their eyes met, and Cade saw it. The precise instant when Roy Vance understood that the world he'd built was collapsing. Not because of the police, not because of the bikers, because Lena was talking, and everything Roy had constructed, every lie, every threat, every carefully maintained silence, depended on Lena never, ever talking. Roy's right hand closed into a fist, not an unconscious gesture, a decision. Cade saw it travel through the man's body the way a current travels through a wire, from the brain, through the shoulder, through the arm, into the hand, each joint tightening in sequence, the physics of intent made flesh. Drummond saw it too. His hand moved to his belt. "Sir." A second cruiser turned onto Briar Lane. Behind it, an unmarked sedan, Children's Services, or whatever the county called it. The cavalry, arriving in bureaucratic formation, paperwork already generating in the back seats. Roy let his hand open. Slowly. Finger by finger. Like releasing something he'd been holding for so long his tendons had forgotten the shape of an open palm. He sat down on the porch steps, put his head in his hands, and became very, very still. It was not the stillness of surrender. Cade recognized the difference. Surrender was a collapse inward, the body giving up, going soft, accepting. This was the stillness of recalculation. Roy Vance was sitting on his porch in the falling snow, surrounded by police cars and bikers, and the sound of his girlfriend's voice finally saying all the things she'd been forbidden to say. And he was thinking, planning, restructuring. Men like Roy didn't stop. They adapted. Cade dropped his cigarette into the snow. It hissed. He watched the ember die, then looked up at the house. at the windows, at the porch light, at the dark interior visible through the still open front door, and felt the weight of something he hadn't expected settling over him like a second jacket. Responsibility. Not the legal kind. Not the kind that came with documents and obligations and the machinery of the system now grinding to life around him. The other kind. The kind that lived in the space between walking away and staying. The kind that didn't have a name because most people avoided it so thoroughly they never needed one. He'd come here to get a child out of a house. He'd done that. The boys were safe. The police were here. The system, for all its fractures and failures, was engaging. By every reasonable measure, his part was done. But reasonable measures were built by people who'd never sat in the back of a cruiser at 10 years old, watching through fogged glass as the adults who were supposed to protect them negotiated with the adults who were hurting them and went home at the end of the shift. Cade turned to Roach. "I need a favor." Roach's eyebrows lifted a fraction. In their 11 years of riding together, Cade had asked for a favor exactly twice. Once when he needed bail. Once when he needed someone to sit with him in the VA hospital waiting room while they ran tests on his liver. Both times, Roach had simply nodded and gone. "I need you to call Priest." The silence that followed was thick enough to stand on. Priest. Real name Thomas Wakefield, VP of the Mother Chapter. A man who had survived 3 decades of the most dangerous roads in the country and emerged not louder or harder, but quieter. A silence so dense it had its own gravity. Priest didn't ride anymore. His spine had been fused in 2 places after a wreck in '09 that killed his riding partner and left him walking with a cane he refused to use in public. He ran the club's legal contacts now. Not a lawyer himself, but a man who had accumulated, over 30 years, a network of attorneys, social workers, and county officials who owed him favors for reasons nobody discussed. Calling Priest meant escalating. It meant this was no longer a roadside rescue. It meant the club was investing resources, attention, and reputation into something that could go wrong in a dozen different ways. Roach knew all of this. He studied Cade's face for a long time, reading it the way he read a highway, scanning for hazards, calculating distances, measuring the space between where they were and where they were about to go. "You sure?" "I'm sure. Because once Priest is in, we don't back out. That's how it works. You know that." "I know." "Those aren't our kids, Cade." The words hung in the air between them. Not cruel, not dismissive, just honest. The honest assessment of a man who'd watched friends die for causes smaller than the ones they carried and bigger than the ones they chose. Roach wasn't questioning the rescue. He was questioning the commitment. There was a difference, and it was a difference measured in years, not hours. Cade looked toward the cruiser. Through the fogged window, he could see Eli's shape, small, hunched, his arms still around Noah, his face turned toward the house where his mother stood in the snow, telling officers things she'd never said aloud before. "They're somebody's kids," Cade said, "and somebody wasn't enough." Roach held his gaze for 3 more seconds. Then he pulled out his phone, turned away from the wind, and dialed. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. Cade couldn't hear the words, but he could hear the rhythm. Roach's voice low and clipped, then silence as Priest responded, then Roach again, then a longer silence. When Roach hung up, his face had changed. Not dramatically, a slight tightening around the mouth, the particular expression of a man who had just set something in motion that couldn't be stopped. "Priest wants to know if the kid has family." "I don't know." "He says find out, before the county does. Because if the county places those boys in emergency foster care tonight, getting them out is a 6-month legal fight we don't have the money for." Cade nodded, turned toward the officers, started walking. Halfway across the lawn, Dutch intercepted him, stepped directly into his path, a wall of sandstone and silence that stopped Cade as effectively as a locked door. "What are you doing?" Cade looked at him. Dutch rarely asked questions. When he did, they mattered. "Going to talk to the officer." "And say what?" "That I'm involved." Dutch's face didn't move. His eyes did. A slow lateral scan that took in the cruisers, the officers, Roy sitting on the porch, Lena now weeping openly in the snow, while a woman from the unmarked sedan stood beside her with a clipboard and a face that was trying very hard to be compassionate but was mostly just cold. Dutch absorbed all of it the way a sponge absorbs water, quietly, completely, without any visible change to the surface. You know what they'll find when they run your name? It wasn't a question. It was a reminder. Cade's record wasn't long, but it was ugly. 2 assault charges, 1 dismissed, 1 pleaded down to a misdemeanor. A DUI from 2017 that he'd served 90 days for. A restraining order from an ex-girlfriend who'd later recanted but whose filing still lived in whatever database the county used to measure a man's worthiness to stand near children. In the mathematics of the system, Cade Mercer was not a protector. He was a risk factor. I know, Cade said. And you're walking over there anyway. Yeah. Dutch studied him for another moment, then stepped aside. As Cade passed, Dutch said one more thing, quietly, almost too soft to hear over the wind and the idling engines and the distant crackle of police radios. Then we're all in. Cade stopped, turned. Dutch was already walking back toward his bike, not leaving, just repositioning, the way a piece moves on a chessboard. Deliberate, committed, occupying a square from which retreat was no longer the architecture of the game. Cade walked the rest of the way to Officer Hale. The older officer saw him coming, turned. His face carried the particular expression of a man who had been doing this job long enough to know that the most dangerous moment in any domestic call wasn't the violence. It was the aftermath. The part where everyone standing in the wreckage had to decide what shape the future was going to take. Officer, Cade said, I need to tell you something. Hale waited. The boy, Eli. He walked 4 miles in the snow to find help. He came into a diner on Route 14 and asked a room full of strangers where the police station was. He told us his brother was still in the house. He told us about Roy. I understand. No, you don't. Cade kept his voice low, steady, not confrontational, the opposite. The voice of a man stripping away every defense he had and offering the raw thing underneath. He told us his mother called the police twice before. He said they came and left. He said Roy convinced them nothing was wrong. Hale's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. But Cade was reading faces the way he read roads tonight. Every crack, every shadow, every shift in the surface. I'm telling you this, Cade continued, because I need you to understand what that boy did. He didn't run to the police, he tried that. His mother tried that. The system failed them, twice. And tonight, a 10-year-old kid decided his only option was to walk 4 miles in the snow and ask a stranger in a leather jacket for help. Silence. Snow falling between them. The radio on Hale's shoulder crackled and went quiet. So when the county asks what happened here tonight, Cade said, I need you to remember what I just told you, because those boys are going to need someone who remembers. Hale looked at Cade for a long time. Not the way the young officer had looked at him, with suspicion and the reflexive distrust of a man reading surfaces. This was something else. This was one damaged man recognizing another, the way animals recognize their own species through scent and sound before sight ever confirms it. I'll remember, Hale said. Behind them, the door of the Children's Services sedan opened. A woman stepped out with a phone pressed to her ear, speaking rapidly. The words emergency placement drifted across the snow. And Cade realized, with the sudden lurching clarity of a man who has just stepped off a ledge and discovered the ground is much farther down than he thought, that saving those boys from Roy Vance's house was the easy part. Keeping them from disappearing into a system designed to process children like paperwork was the war that was just beginning. On the porch, Roy Vance lifted his head from his hands and smiled. Not at the officers, not at Lena, at Cade. A smile that said, You think this is over. You think you won something tonight. But I know things about how this works that you haven't even begun to understand. And when the lights leave and the paperwork starts and everyone goes home and forgets, I'll still be here. Cade held the stare. Didn't blink, didn't breathe. Held it until the snow filled the space between them like static, and the porch light flickered again, and somewhere inside the house a phone began to ring, shrill, insistent, unanswered, filling Briar Lane with a sound like a warning that had come too late and would keep ringing long after everyone stopped listening. The phone inside Roy Vance's house rang 11 times before it stopped. Cade counted everyone. He stood in the snow on Briar Lane with his boots soaking through and his cigarette dead between his fingers and the cold eating through his leather jacket like acid, and he counted because counting was something his mind did when the rest of him was trying not to come apart. An old habit. Prison arithmetic. Count the cracks in the ceiling. Count the seconds between a guard's footsteps. Count anything, anything at all, to keep the machinery of your thoughts from seizing up when the world tilts sideways and the ground you thought was solid turns out to be ice over black water. 11 rings. Then silence. Then the phone started again. Somebody wanted Roy Vance very badly. The Children's Services woman, her name tag read C. Whitfield, though nobody had used it, was leading Lena toward the unmarked sedan. Lena walked the way. People walk through wreckage after a natural disaster, slowly, carefully, testing each step as if the ground might give way beneath her. Her bathrobe was soaked. Snow clung to her hair. She'd stopped crying, but her face still carried the architecture of tears, swollen eyes, trembling lips. The particular devastation of a woman who had just detonated the silence she'd been surviving inside for 2 years, and was now standing in the blast radius, wondering if what she'd done was courage or catastrophe. Eli and Noah sat in the back of Officer Hale's cruiser. The engine was running. The heater was on. Through the fogged window, Cade could see Noah's head resting on Eli's shoulder. The first time all night the younger boy had been still without being frozen. Eli's eyes were open, watching, always watching, that 10-year-old radar spinning in the dark, scanning every frequency for danger. Roy was still on the porch, sitting, hands on his knees. 2 officers flanking him now. Drummond and a third who'd arrived with the backup unit, a woman whose name Cade didn't catch. They weren't arresting him, they were securing the scene, which was a phrase that meant standing near a dangerous man while the paperwork caught up with the reality. Cade's phone buzzed in his jacket. He pulled it out. The screen glowed white in the dark. Priest. One word in the text message, dockside, 40 minutes. Cade pocketed the phone, looked at Roach. Roach had already read the message, not over Cade's shoulder, but in Cade's face. After 11 years, the man could read Cade's expressions the way air traffic controllers read radar. Every blip meant something. He wants us at the warehouse? Roach asked. 40 minutes. It's a 30-minute ride in this weather. Then we leave now. Roach looked toward the cruiser, toward the boys. His face did something complicated. A series of micro-expressions that cycled through concern, calculation, and something that might have been grief if grief were a thing. Dennis Kowalski allowed himself to feel outside the walls of the VA bathroom, where he sometimes sat on the floor at 3 a.m. and shook with something that wasn't cold. We can't just leave them here. We're not leaving them. We're going to get them something the county can't provide. Which is? A chance that doesn't expire in 6 months when someone closes a file. Dutch appeared beside them, materializing from the darkness near the garage the way he always did. Silently, suddenly, like a man whose relationship with physical space was more negotiation than navigation. He'd heard the exchange, didn't need to be told. I'll stay, Dutch said. Cade looked at him. Dutch staying meant Dutch watching. Not the officers, not Roy, but the system. The mechanics of intake. Where the boys went. Which car? Which facility? The name of the caseworker. The details that disappeared if nobody was standing close enough to memorize them. You sure? Dutch didn't dignify the question. He turned, walked to his Harley, killed the engine he'd left idling, and positioned himself on the curb 10 feet from the cruiser, like a gargoyle made of leather and bad intentions. Arms crossed, back straight, face unreadable. The officers noticed, didn't comment. There was something about Dutch's stillness that made asking him to move feel not just confrontational, but structurally unsafe, like asking a load-bearing wall to step aside. Cade and Roach rode out. The snow had turned to freezing rain somewhere between Briar Lane and the highway. That particular Midwest treachery where the temperature hung at the exact threshold between states of matter and the road surface became a guessing game of black ice and wet asphalt. Cade rode the way he always rode in bad weather, slower than instinct wanted, faster than caution recommended. His body making constant micro-adjustments to the bike's balance, like a man walking a tightrope over a canyon he refused to look down into. Roach rode behind, close, the single headlight of his Road King throwing Cade's shadow forward onto the wet road like a companion that arrived everywhere before he did. They didn't speak. Wind and the engine noise and the freezing rain made conversation impossible, which was fine, because the conversation happening inside Cade's skull was loud enough for both of them. Roy Vance's smile. That was the thing Cade couldn't shake. Not the violence, not the bruises, not even Noah's flinch. The smile. The absolute unbothered confidence of a man who'd watched his world crack open and responded not with panic, but with patience. The smile of someone who knew something, who had a card he hadn't played, who was sitting on that porch in handcuffed distance of two police officers and smiling because the game wasn't over. It was just entering a phase he'd planned for. What did Roy Vance know that made him smile like that? The dockside was a warehouse 3 miles south of town, set back from the river road behind a chain-link fence that had been cut and re-welded so many times it looked like abstract sculpture. It had been a boat storage facility in the 70s, then a feed depot, then nothing. The club had been using it for 8 years as a meeting space, a workshop, and on nights when the world pressed down hard enough, a bunker. Priest was already inside. Kate saw his truck parked at the far end of the lot, a black F-250 with tinted windows and a handicap placard hanging from the mirror that Priest never used at actual handicap spaces because, as he put it, there's always somebody who needs it worse. The man had a fused spine and walked with a limp that got worse in cold weather, and he still wouldn't park in the blue zone. That was Priest, stubborn down to the molecular level. Inside, the warehouse was lit by a single bank of fluorescent tubes that cast everything in that flat, buzzing, institutional light that made every surface look slightly ill. The space smelled like motor oil, cold concrete, and the ghost of 1,000 cigarettes smoked over 8 years of meetings that ranged from routine to desperate. A long metal table sat in the center, surrounded by mismatched chairs, folding, wooden, one ancient office chair with a broken wheel that spun in circles if you sat wrong. Priest sat at the head of the table, 63 years old, gray hair pulled back in a ponytail that reached his shoulder blades. A face that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts, a nose broken twice, a jaw that sat slightly off-center, eyes that were the color of old denim and carried the particular weight of a man who had buried more friends than most people ever made. He wore a flannel shirt under his cut. No leather tonight. The cold was in his spine and leather made it worse. His cane, the one he refused to use in public, leaned against the table beside his hand. A thermos of coffee sat in front of him, steam curling upward into the fluorescent light. He didn't look up when Cade and Roach entered. He was reading something on his phone, his face illuminated from below by the screen's pale glow, and the shadows it cast turned his features into a topography of angles and recessions that made him look ancient. Cade sat down across from him. Roach took the chair to Cade's left. For a moment, the only sound was the rain hitting the metal roof, a constant, shimmering percussion, like static from a broken radio turned up too loud. "Tell me about the boy," Priest said without looking up. Cade told him. All of it. The diner, the bruise, Eli's 4-mile walk through the snow, Noah's flinch, Roy Vance's practiced calm, and the house on Briar Lane, and the officers who came, and the mother who finally spoke, and the system that was now grinding its gears around 2 children who had already been ground down enough. Priest listened the way Priest always listened, completely, absorptively, without interruption or visible reaction. His face didn't move. His eyes stayed on his phone screen. Only his thumb moved, scrolling slowly through whatever he was reading. When Cade finished, the silence lasted long enough for the rain to intensify, hammering the roof in a sudden crescendo that made the fluorescent lights flicker. "Roy Vance," Priest said. "Yeah, Roy Allen Vance, 44, born in Millhaven, former employee of Data Point Logistics, 2 DUIs, 1 domestic complaint, filed and withdrawn, currently unemployed." Cade stared at him. "You already looked him up." Priest set the phone down, turned it face up on the table so Cade and Roach could see the screen. On it was a county record search, the kind of deep pull database that wasn't publicly accessible without either a law enforcement login or a friend who had one and owed you a favor. "I looked him up the minute Roach called. Because you don't call me about a bar fight or a busted taillight. You call me when something's wrong in a way that doesn't have a simple fix. So I started pulling threads." He paused, picked up his thermos, took a slow sip of coffee, set it down. The deliberateness of his movements was almost ceremonial. The pace of a man who understood that speed was the enemy of comprehension and that the next words out of his mouth were going to change the shape of the room. Roy Vance doesn't exist. The rain kept hammering. The fluorescents kept buzzing. But inside the warehouse, something shifted. A tectonic realignment. like the first crack in a dam that's been holding back pressure for years. What do you mean he doesn't exist? Roach said. I mean, the name is real. The social security number is real. The driver's license is real. But the person attached to them is a construction. Roy Allen Vance was born in Millhaven in 1982, attended Millhaven High School, worked at Data Point for 6 years. All verifiable, all documented, and all of it was generated. Priest slid the phone across the table. Cade picked it up, stared at the screen. The records were there, clean, organized, bureaucratically impeccable. Employment history, tax filings, a lease agreement from 2019. Everything a person needed to prove they were a person, arranged with the meticulous precision of someone who understood that identity was not something you were born with, but something you built, brick by brick, document by document, until the architecture was indistinguishable from the real thing. Generated by who? That's the question, isn't it? Priest leaned back. His chair creaked. The cane beside him shifted, tapping against the table leg with a sound that was too quiet for the weight of what he was saying. I made 3 calls after Roach hung up. 1 to a bail bondsman in Crestline who owes me for his daughter's custody case. 1 to a court clerk in the county seat who's been feeding me public records for 4 years. And 1 to a retired marshal I used to ride with in the 90s who now works private investigations out of a trailer in Henderson. Each name was delivered without elaboration. Priest's network was vast, deeply personal, and operated on a currency of favors that had been accumulating for 30 years. He didn't explain it. He didn't need to. The fact that 3 people had answered phones at 10 o'clock on a winter night and provided sensitive information within an hour told you everything you needed to know about the kind of debts Thomas Wakefield collected. The marshal ran the social through a federal skip trace database. The number was issued in 1982, which checks out. But it was flagged in 2014 as part of a bulk identity investigation in Crestline County. 14 social security numbers, all issued legitimately to real people, were being used by individuals who were not those people. Cade's stomach went cold. Not the cold of the weather outside. The cold that starts in the center of your body and radiates outward when your brain processes information faster than your emotions can follow. A full system temperature drop that leaves you functionally numb while the gears spin. Identity theft. Deeper than that. Priest took another sip of coffee. His eyes were steady. The investigation was sealed. 14 identities, all in the same county, all tied to a single network. The charges ranged from fraud to child endangerment. The last 2 words landed on the table like a body dropping from a height. Child endangerment. Roach stood up. The chair scraped against the concrete with a sound like a scream cut short. He didn't pace, or Roach never paced, but he moved to the wall, put both palms flat against the cold cinder block, and stood there, breathing, his back to the room, the tendons in his neck standing out like cables under tension. What network? Cade asked. His voice was level. The rest of him was not. The investigation was sealed, Priest repeated. My contact couldn't access the full file, but he pulled the case summary. 14 false identities, all male, all living in different locations across 3 counties, all in households with children under 12. The warehouse was silent except for the rain and the fluorescence and the sound of Roach's breathing against the wall. You're telling me Roy Vance isn't just a drunk with heavy hands. I'm telling you that Roy Allen Vance is a name attached to a sealed investigation involving men who assumed false identities and positioned themselves in households with access to children. I'm telling you that the investigation was sealed, which means either it's ongoing or it was shut down by someone with the authority to seal it. And I'm telling you that the man currently sitting on a porch on Briar Lane smiling at police officers is not the person his documents say he is. Cade looked at the phone in his hand. The screen had dimmed. He tapped it back to life. Stared at the records, the employment history, the tax filings, the lease agreement. The perfect meticulous architecture of a life that didn't belong to the man living it. He thought about Eli, about the bruise on the boy's jaw, about the 4 miles of frozen road between that house and the diner. About what kind of desperation makes a 10-year-old walk that far in the snow. He'd assumed, they'd all assumed, that the desperation was about fists, about a drunk man with a temper and no boundaries, about the simple, ugly geometry of domestic violence. But what if the bruise wasn't the secret? What if the bruise was just the part of the secret that was visible? We need to get those boys out tonight, Cade said. That's what I've been telling you. Not just out of the house, out of the county, away from whatever this is. Priest shook his head, slowly. The motion carried the weight of experience, not disagreement, but the particular patience of a man who had spent 3 decades watching good intentions crash against the machinery of systems that didn't bend for urgency. You can't, not legally. They're not your kids. You have no standing. The county has already initiated intake. The moment Children's Services opened that car door, those boys entered the system, and the system has procedures, and the procedures have timelines, and the timelines don't give a damn about what you found on a database at 11 o'clock at night. Then what do we do? Priest pulled a folded piece of paper from his shirt pocket, set it on the table, unfolded it with the careful, methodical movements of a man whose hands hurt in the cold, but who refused to let the pain dictate his pace. It was a name, written in Priest's small, precise handwriting. A woman's name, with a phone number below it, and an address in a town Cade didn't recognize. Margaret Harlan, family attorney, Crestline District. She handled the Jennings case 4 years ago. 3 kids pulled from a foster home after one of them ended up in the ICU. She won custody for the grandmother in 6 weeks, which is unheard of. She's expensive. She's difficult. She doesn't like bikers. And she's the only person within 200 miles who can walk into a county hearing Monday morning and make a judge listen to what I just told you. Cade picked up the paper, looked at the name, looked at Priest. Expensive how? $5,000 retainer, and that's a favor. Roach turned from the wall. The club doesn't have $5,000 sitting around. I know. So what are we doing, Priest? We pulled those kids out of a house. We got the cops there. We did the right thing. Now you're telling us the guy's a ghost, with a manufactured identity connected to some sealed investigation about kids, and the solution is a lawyer we can't afford? Priest looked at Roach with the steady, unhurried gaze of a man who had weathered anger from harder men in worse rooms and found it useful primarily as diagnostic information. I'm telling you what the options are. What you do with them is your decision. But understand this. If Roy Vance is connected to what I think he's connected to, then Eli and Noah aren't just kids who got hit by a drunk boyfriend. They're assets. They have value to the people who put Roy in that house. And when the system processes them, foster care, group homes, the endless bureaucratic shuffle, those people will know exactly where they are. Because the system is a filing cabinet, and filing cabinets can be opened by anyone with the right key. The thermos was empty. Priest set it aside, placed both hands flat on the table, palms down, fingers spread, the gesture of a man laying all his cards out and waiting for someone to pick them up. So the question isn't whether you can afford a lawyer. The question is what happens to those boys if you can't. Cade's phone buzzed. Dutch. The text was 4 words long, 4 words that changed everything. Roy just posted bail. Cade read it twice, 3 times. The words didn't rearrange themselves. They sat on the screen, blunt and final, glowing in the dim light of the warehouse like an exit sign above a door that opened onto nothing. He was arrested? Dutch's reply came immediately, typed fast, punctuation absent, charged with misdemeanor domestic. Bail set at $500, paid cash. Walked out 20 minutes ago. Officers didn't hold him. Lena and boys taken to county intake on Mason Street, $500. That was the number the system placed on the safety of 2 children. The cost of a used appliance. The price of a weekend of drinking. The amount of money that stood between Roy Vance, or whoever Roy Vance actually was, and the freedom to disappear, regroup, and do whatever men connected to sealed investigations involving children did when their cover identities began to crack. He's out, Cade said. His voice was quiet, not calm. The difference was important. Calm was the absence of turbulence. Quiet was turbulence compressed so tightly it became a solid, dense, contained, and infinitely more dangerous. Priest didn't react, not visibly, but his hands, still flat on the table, pressed down. A fraction of an inch, a fraction of a pound of force, the smallest possible physical expression of the weight that had just settled on the room. Then we moved tonight. Roach came back to the table, sat down. His shaking had stopped. Not because the neurological condition had taken a break, but because the adrenaline had overridden it, flooding his system with chemicals that temporarily outranked whatever was wrong with his wiring. His eyes were sharp, clear. The eyes of a man who'd spent 20 years knowing exactly what incoming fire sounded like and was hearing it now. Move how? Margaret Harlan. Tonight. I'll make the call. Priest reached for his phone. Cade, you go to county intake on Mason Street. Find Dutch. Stay close to those boys. Don't leave them alone in that building. And Roy? Priest paused. His thumb hovered over the phone screen. He looked at Cade, a long, measuring look that carried the weight of every decision the club had ever made under his guidance. Every line they'd drawn, every line they'd crossed, every moment where the distance between justice and vengeance narrowed to a space so thin you could cut yourself walking through it. Roy is not your problem tonight. The boys are your problem tonight. Keep your eyes on what matters. And if Roy comes to Mason Street, he won't, not tonight. Men like Roy don't go to buildings full of social workers and intake officers hours after posting bail. They go somewhere quiet. They make phone calls. They talk to the people who built the identity that's starting to fall apart. And those people, whoever they are, will have a plan. They always have a plan. Our job right now is to move faster than the plan. Cade stood. The chair scraped. The sound echoed off the warehouse ceiling, a sharp metallic note that hung in the air like a struck bell. Roach, you're with me. Priest, I'll be at the dockside. I'll have Harlan on the phone within the hour. And Cade, Priest picked up his cane. Not to use, to hold. A habit from decades of gripping something solid when the words he needed to say were too heavy to carry in his hands alone. When you get to that intake office, they're going to ask you who you are. They're going to ask your relationship to the children. They're going to look at your jacket and your record and your face, and they're going to see exactly what Officer Drummond saw tonight. A threat. Not a protector. A threat. And every instinct you have is going to tell you to fight that, to argue, to explain. Don't. Then what? Be what you are. Man who showed up. Let them judge you. Let them write whatever they write in whatever file they open. And stay. Because in 3 years, when a judge reviews the case history and sees that a man with a felony-adjacent record sat in a county intake office at midnight in the middle of a snowstorm because 2 boys he'd never met needed someone to sit there, that's the thing that changes the math. Not lawyers. Not money. Presence. Cade looked at him. The word landed somewhere deep, below the anger, below the urgency, in the place where his 10-year-old self still sat in a room waiting for someone to walk through the door and stay. He nodded once, turned, walked toward the warehouse exit, Roach falling in behind him. The rain had intensified, a freezing downpour that turned the parking lot into a sheet of black glass reflecting the orange glow of a single sodium light mounted above the entrance. His phone buzzed again. Dutch. This time the message was longer, typed in the particular staccato that Dutch used when his hands were shaking, not from his usual silence, but from something else. Something that made a man who said 40 words on a good day suddenly need to say more. Cade. Something wrong. Lena talking to intake worker. Says Roy isn't the only one. Says there was a man before Roy. Same pattern. Showed up. Moved in. Controlled everything. Left after 18 months. Then Roy came. She says someone sent them. Both of them. She says someone is placing these men in homes with kids on purpose. Cade stopped in the doorway. The rain hit his face. He didn't feel it. He read the message again, each word landing like a hammer blow on the inside of his skull. Not one man. A pattern. A system. Men placed in homes with children the way pieces were placed on a board. Deliberately, strategically, by someone who understood that vulnerable mothers with limited options and no support systems were not victims, but infrastructure. The phone buzzed one more time. Lena says there are other houses, other kids. She doesn't know how many. But she heard Roy on the phone. Names. Addresses. A list. Cade turned to look at Roach. Roach had read the screen over his shoulder. His face was the color of the concrete beneath their feet. His shaking hands had gone perfectly still, the stillness of a sniper's hands before a shot. The body overriding every malfunction in the system, because the moment demanded nothing less than absolute mechanical precision. This isn't a rescue anymore, Roach said. No. This is something else. Yeah. How much else? Cade looked out at the rain, at the Harleys sitting in the parking lot under sheets of freezing water, at the road beyond the fence that led back to town, back to Mason Street, back to a county intake office, where a woman he'd met 2 hours ago was unraveling a conspiracy that went deeper than any of them had imagined when a boy walked into a diner and asked where the police station was. Enough, Cade said, that we're not the biggest danger on that street anymore. He threw his leg over the softail, kicked the engine to life. The sound filled the parking lot, deep, rolling, furious, a sound that had no patience left in it. And as he pulled out onto the frozen road with Roach behind him, and the rain turning to sleet, and the night closing in like a fist, Cade realized that the promise he'd made on that porch, the promise that Roy Vance would never touch those boys again, was no longer a promise about one man. It was a promise about a machine, a network, a system within the system, built on false names and manufactured lives and children who existed in filing cabinets that the wrong people knew how to open. And somewhere in the dark behind him, a phone was ringing in an empty house on Briar Lane. Roy Vance, whoever he was, had already answered it. Mason Street smelled like floor wax and exhaustion. The county intake office occupied the ground floor of a building that had been a hardware store in the 80s, a tax preparation office in the 90s, and was now the kind of municipal facility that existed because someone had to put it somewhere and nobody wanted it near anything that mattered. Fluorescent lights, drop ceiling tiles stained brown from a leak nobody had fixed, plastic chairs bolted to the wall in rows of 6, the kind designed not for comfort but for endurance, seats that assumed you'd be waiting a long time and didn't care if your back agreed. Cade walked in at 11:47, Roach behind him, both soaked, both trailing water across the linoleum in dark, spreading patterns that the night janitor would mop up later without knowing or caring whose boots had left them. Dutch was already there. He sat in the last plastic chair against the far wall, arms crossed, face arranged in that particular expression of monumental stillness that made him look less like a man waiting and more like a geological formation that happened to be wearing a leather jacket. His eyes moved when Cade entered. A lateral sweep that took in the room, confirmed the relevant data, and returned to their default position, fixed on the hallway door through which Lena and the boys had disappeared 40 minutes ago. "Where are they?" Cade asked. "Back room, separate interviews. Lena's with a caseworker. Boys are with someone else. Haven't seen them since they went through." "Roy?" "Nothing. No sign. No vehicle. I've been watching the parking lot." Cade sat down. The plastic chair groaned under his weight. He leaned forward, elbows on knees, and stared at the floor between his boots. A strip of gray linoleum so worn the pattern had been erased by years of shuffling feet, leaving behind a surface that looked like skin after a burn. Smooth, featureless, stripped of everything that once gave it texture. His phone buzzed. "Priest. Harlan is in. Retainer handled. She'll be at County Courthouse, 8 a.m. Monday." "But Cade, she needs Lena's cooperation. Without the mother on record, there's no standing. Get Lena to agree before the county assigns a public advocate. Once that happens, we lose control of the timeline." Cade read it twice. Pocketed the phone. The retainer was handled, which meant Priest had paid it himself, out of whatever savings a 63-year-old man with a fused spine and no pension had managed to accumulate over 3 decades of living on the margins of a country that didn't build safety nets for men like him. $5,000. The cost of a used motorcycle. The cost of 6 months of groceries. The cost of Priest's quiet, stubborn belief that some things were worth going broke for. Roach sat down beside Cade, pulled a cigarette from his jacket pocket, looked at the no smoking sign on the wall, and put the cigarette behind his ear with the resigned patience of a man who'd been denied small comfort so many times the denial itself had become a comfort, familiar, predictable, something to push against when everything else was chaos. "What's the play?" Roach asked. "We wait for Lena. When she comes out, I talk to her." "And say what?" "Hi, we're the bikers from your yard. We have a lawyer. Also, your boyfriend is a manufactured identity connected to a child exploitation network. Sign here." Cade looked at him. Roach's sarcasm was diagnostic. A pressure valve he opened when the internal readings got too high. The worse the situation, the sharper the humor. Tonight, the humor had edges that could draw blood. "I'll figure it out when I see her face. That's not a plan. It's what I've got." They waited. Minutes passed with the thick, syrupy slowness of institutional time. The particular quality of duration that exists only in hospitals, courtrooms, and government offices, where clocks seemed to move through a denser medium than the rest of the world. The building creaked around them. The heating system cycled, a low rhythmic groan from somewhere in the walls, like the building itself was breathing. At 12:22, the hallway door opened. A woman emerged. Not Lena. A caseworker. Mid-40s, wire-rimmed glasses, hair pulled back tight enough to suggest that control was not just a professional preference, but a survival strategy. She carried a manila folder in one hand and a phone in the other, and her face wore the expression of someone who had seen the inside of too many files that contained too many of the same words. She looked at the three bikers. Her eyes moved from Cade to Roach to Dutch, and performed the same calculation every civilian performed when confronted with leather jackets and road-worn faces in an enclosed space. Threat assessment, probability analysis, the unconscious arithmetic of physical danger. "Can I help you?" "We're here for the Marsden family," Cade said. "Are you family?" "No." "Then I'm afraid I can't discuss. I'm the one who brought the boys in tonight." The caseworker paused, looked at her folder. Something in the paperwork confirmed what Cade said, because her posture shifted, not relaxing exactly, but recalibrating. The threat assessment adjusted. The arithmetic changed. "Mr. Mercer?" "Yeah." "Officer Hale's report mentions you. You're listed as the individual who responded to the older child's request for help." "That's right." She studied him, the scar, the tattoo, the leather, the everything. Cade let her look. Didn't shift. Didn't soften. Didn't perform anything. He sat in that plastic chair with his wet jacket dripping on the floor and let this woman see exactly what he was. A man with a record and a history and a face that had been rearranged by violence and a reason for being in this building at midnight that had nothing to do with obligation and everything to do with the fact that a boy had asked him for help and the asking had broken something open that couldn't be closed. "The children are being processed for emergency placement," the caseworker said. "Their mother is cooperating. A temporary foster arrangement will be identified by morning." "What about their safety?" "Excuse me?" "Roy Vance posted bail 2 hours ago. He's out, and I have reason to believe he's not who his documents say he is." The caseworker's expression didn't change, but her hand tightened on the manila folder, a micro contraction of the fingers that crumpled the edge of the cardboard by a fraction of an inch. She knew something, or suspected something. The reaction was too controlled to be surprise and too physical to be indifference. "Mr. Mercer, I appreciate your concern, but the safety assessment is being handled by our office in coordination with law enforcement. If you have information about Mr. Vance, I'd encourage you to contact the sheriff's department directly." Bureaucratic deflection. Cade recognized it the way a mechanic recognized a specific engine knock, immediately, instinctively, with the certainty that comes from having heard the same sound in 100 different machines. "I'm not going to the sheriff's department. I'm talking to you, because you're the person who decides where those boys sleep tonight. And I need you to understand that the man they've been living with is operating under a false identity connected to a sealed investigation involving children." Silence. The heating system groaned. Roach's unlit cigarette sat behind his ear like a tiny flag of surrender to forces beyond his control. The caseworker looked at Cade for a long time. Then she did something he didn't expect. She sat down. Not in a chair. On the edge of the reception desk, which was unprofessional and slightly awkward and completely human. She set the folder on her lap, took off her glasses, rubbed the bridge of her nose with thumb and forefinger, the universal gesture of a person who is too tired and too overwhelmed to maintain the performance their job requires. "I know," she said. 2 words. Quiet. Stripped of everything institutional. "Lena told me about the phone calls, about the man before Roy, about the pattern." She put her glasses back on. "I've been doing this for 16 years, Mr. Mercer. I've seen things in this office that I can't talk about because they live in sealed files and confidentiality agreements, and the kind of legal architecture that exists specifically to prevent people like me from saying what I know to people like you." She paused, looked at the hallway door behind her, as if verifying that no one was listening. "But I will tell you this. Those boys are not going into general placement tonight. I'm making a call to a specialized facility in Ridgemont. It's 30 miles from here. It's secure, and the intake coordinator is someone I trust personally. They'll be safe there until Monday." "And Lena?" "Lena will be offered a bed at the women's shelter on 4th Street. Whether she takes it is her decision. I need to talk to her. That's not something I can. 5 minutes, that's all. 5 minutes before she leaves this building. The caseworker looked at him. At Roach. At Dutch, who hadn't moved or spoken since Kate arrived, but whose presence in the room operated on a frequency that was impossible to ignore. The low, constant hum of a man whose stillness was not passivity, but potential energy stored to a dangerous density. 5 minutes, she said. In the hallway. I'll be at the desk. She stood, walked to the hallway door, opened it, spoke to someone inside. Low, brief, the murmured negotiation of institutional gatekeepers passing a person from one controlled space to another. Lena emerged. She looked smaller than she had on Briar Lane. The bathrobe was gone. Someone had given her a county-issue sweatshirt and a pair of pants that didn't fit. Her hair was down now, damp, hanging around a face that had aged 10 years in 3 hours. Her eyes were red but dry. She'd moved past crying into the territory beyond, that blasted, hollow landscape where emotions have burned through their fuel and left behind only the char. She saw Cade, stopped, looked at him with an expression that contained so many competing signals. It was like trying to read a radio tuned to 5 stations at once. Gratitude, fear, suspicion, exhaustion, and underneath all of it, the faint, persistent pulse of the hope he'd seen on the porch. Damaged but alive. Flickering but not extinguished. Eli told me what you did, she said. I didn't do anything. Your boy did all of it. She shook her head, a small motion. He walked 4 miles. In the snow. He's 10 years old and he walked 4 miles because I was too scared to walk 12 feet. You walked the 12 feet tonight. Too late. You're standing here. Your boys are safe. It's not too late. Lena's hands were shaking. She pressed them against her thighs, hard, the knuckles whitening, the gesture of a person physically holding themselves together. They're going to take my kids. They're going to protect your kids. There's a difference. And there's a lawyer, Margaret Harlan, Crestline District, who's going to be at the courthouse Monday morning to make sure the protection doesn't become permanent separation. Lena looked at him. The name meant nothing to her. The legal framework meant nothing to her. What mattered, what Cade could see mattering in the way her eyes focused and her breathing changed, was that someone was talking about Monday, about a future, about a sequence of events that extended beyond the next 3 hours and implied that the world hadn't ended, that the wreckage she'd created tonight by opening her mouth was not the final landscape, but the clearing of ground for something else. Why are you doing this? She asked. You don't know me. You don't know my kids. Cade looked at her. The answer to her question was buried in 31 years of scar tissue, in a childhood he'd never told anyone about completely, in rooms he'd sat in that looked exactly like this one, in the sound of his own voice at 10 years old asking a stranger for help and receiving silence in return. Because somebody should have done it for me, he said, and nobody did. Lena's face broke, not dramatically. A hairline fracture that ran from her eyes to her mouth and let something out that she'd been holding back since the first officer asked her to tell the truth. Not tears. Something rawer. The sound a person makes when they realize they are not alone in the specific way they've been alone, that the stranger standing in front of them carries the same wound in a different body and recognizes it the way you recognize your own handwriting. Lena, I need you to listen to me. Roy is not who he says he is. The name, the history, the social security number, it's manufactured. He's connected to something bigger, something involving other homes, other children. You told the caseworker about the man before Roy, about the phone calls, about the pattern. She nodded, barely. That information is the most important thing you've said tonight, more important than the bruises, more important than anything Roy did to you or your boys. Because if what you described is real, if someone is placing these men in homes with children on purpose, then Eli and Noah aren't the only ones at risk. Lena's hands stopped shaking. Something changed behind her eyes, a shift from victim to witness, from the woman things happened to into the woman who had seen things happen. It was subtle, molecular. But Cade had spent his life reading the moment when a person's relationship to their own pain shifted from passive to active, and he was watching it happen now in a county hallway at midnight under fluorescent lights that made everything look sick except the truth, which looked exactly like it always looked, ugly and necessary and impossible to ignore once you'd seen it. There was a phone, Lena said. Roy had a phone he kept in the garage. Not his regular phone. A different one. Black. No case. He charged it out there and he only used it when I was supposed to be asleep. But I heard him. Through the wall. Talking to someone. Names. Addresses. He'd say a name and then an address and then a number. I thought it was about work. Some kind of delivery schedule. I didn't. Her voice caught. You didn't know. I should have known. You couldn't have. I heard him say Eli's name once. On that phone. To someone else. My son's name in someone else's conversation, and I told myself I misheard. I told myself it was nothing, because if it wasn't nothing, then everything was worse than I could survive. Cade let the silence hold. Didn't fill it. Silence, he'd learned, was where the truth finished assembling itself in a person's mouth before it came out. The phone is still in the garage, Lena whispered, behind the water heater, in a metal box. He doesn't know I know. Cade's pulse didn't change. His expression didn't change. But inside his chest, something locked into place. The final tumbler in a combination he'd been turning since Eli walked into that diner. The phone. Names. Addresses. A network. Evidence that existed not in sealed files or federal databases, but in a metal box behind a water heater in the garage of a gray house on Briar Lane. Evidence that Roy Vance didn't know was compromised. Lena, I need you to do something. I need you to tell Margaret Harlan everything you just told me. Monday morning. Every detail. The phone calls. The man before Roy. The pattern. All of it. Can you do that? Yes. And I need you to accept the bed at the shelter tonight. Stay there. Don't go back to the house. Don't contact Roy. Don't answer calls from numbers you don't recognize. What are you going to do? The question hung in the hallway like smoke. Cade looked at her. At the county-issue sweatshirt and the ill-fitting pants and the face that carried 2 years of damage and 1 night of demolition and the first fragile minutes of something that might, if nothing went wrong, become reconstruction. I'm going to make sure the phone is still there when the people who need it come looking. He didn't say which people. He didn't say when. Because the truth was that Cade didn't know yet. Didn't know if the phone should go to the sheriff's department, to Margaret Harlan, to Priest's retired marshal contact, or to someone else entirely. What he knew was that a piece of evidence existed that connected Roy Vance to a network, and that Roy Vance, currently free, currently aware that his world was unraveling, currently in possession of whatever resources and contacts his manufactured identity provided, would be thinking about that phone too. It was a race now. A race measured not in miles, but in hours. And the starting gun had already fired. Cade walked back to the waiting room. Roach stood up the moment he appeared. Dutch uncrossed his arms. The first voluntary movement he'd made in an hour. We're going back to Briar Lane. Roach's face went through a rapid sequence. Tonight? Right now. The house is a crime scene. There'll be tape. There'll be tape on the front door. There won't be tape on the garage. Dutch understood immediately. His face didn't change, but his body did. A subtle realignment of weight, center of gravity shifting forward. The posture of a man transitioning from waiting to moving. He'd spent 4 years in Leavenworth. He knew what evidence meant. He knew what evidence disappearing meant. And he knew the difference between stealing and securing, which was a legal distinction that lived on a razor's edge that men like them walked every day of their lives. If we get caught inside that property, that's trespassing at minimum, breaking and entering if they want to push it. And with our records, I know. You're asking us to risk prison time for a phone that might not even be there anymore. I'm asking you to ride with me to a house where a man who hurts children kept a phone full of names and addresses of other children who might be in the same situation right now, tonight. While we're sitting in this building talking about risk, Dutch looked at Roach. Roach looked at Dutch. The silent communication lasted 2 seconds and contained more information than most people conveyed in 20 minutes of conversation. Let's go, Dutch said. They rode through the freezing rain, 3 Harleys in formation, cutting through empty streets that glistened like black glass under sodium lights. The town was dead at this hour. Storefronts dark, traffic lights cycling through their colors for no one. The only movement, the rain itself, falling in silver sheets that turned the world into a watercolor painted by someone who only knew shades of gray. Cade led, Roach right, Dutch left. The formation was instinctive. Not a V, not a line, but a triangle with Cade at point, the geometry of movement they'd been riding for a decade. Each man knew the other's speed, braking distance, lean angles in wet conditions. They rode as a single organism. 3 engines, 3 heartbeats, 3 sets of hands, making identical micro-adjustments to identical conditions. Briar Lane was dark. The police cruisers were gone. The children's services sedan was gone. The street had returned to its default state, quiet, residential, the houses sealed against the cold with the particular tightness of homes that didn't want to be seen. Number 412 sat at the curb like a held breath. The porch light was still on. Yellow tape crossed the front door in an X. Bright against the gray siding, a bureaucratic scarecrow meant to ward off the curious. The driveway was empty. Roy's truck, a tan Silverado that Cade remembered from earlier, was gone. But the garage door was closed, and in the gap between the garage door and the concrete, a thin, dark line barely visible from the street, no light shone. Cade killed his engine at the house next door. Coasted the last 30 feet on momentum alone, the bike rolling silent through the rain. Roach and Dutch followed. 3 machines coming to rest like predators settling into a crouch. Still, balanced, ready. No words. Cade dismounted. Walked through the side yard of number 412, staying close to the fence line where shadows were deepest. The rain covered his footsteps. The wet grass soaked through his boots. Behind him, Roach positioned himself at the corner of the garage, watching the street. Dutch went to the back of the property, covering the rear, checking sight lines, the instinctive tactics of a man whose body remembered formations his mind had spent 6 years trying to forget. The garage had a side door, wooden, old, the kind of door held shut by a latch and a padlock that had probably been purchased at the same hardware store that used to occupy the building on Mason Street. The padlock was open. Hanging from the hasp, unclasped, the shackles swinging slightly in the wind. Someone had been here. Recently. In the last hour, maybe less. The metal of the lock was still faintly warm when Cade's fingers closed around it, residual heat from a hand that had held it open and hadn't bothered to close it on the way out. Roy. The realization hit Cade's nervous system before his brain fully processed it. A full-body alert that started at the base of his skull and radiated downward through his spine, flooding his limbs with the electric heaviness of adrenaline. Roy had been here, had come back to the house after posting bail, had gone straight to the garage. Cade pushed the door open. The garage was dark, cold. It smelled like motor oil and sawdust and the particular mustiness of a space that served too many purposes and was maintained for none of them. He pulled out his phone, turned on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating shapes. A workbench covered in tools, a lawnmower with a cracked housing, shelving units loaded with paint cans and cardboard boxes, and the accumulated debris of a life that was, Cade now understood, entirely manufactured. The water heater sat in the far corner. Industrial. Old. The kind of unit that should have been replaced 10 years ago but kept running on stubbornness and mineral deposits. Cade moved to it, crouched, reached behind the unit, his arms scraping against the wall, fingers searching the narrow space between the heater and the cinder block. Nothing. He reached further, pressed his shoulder against the tank. The metal was cold. His fingers found dust, cobwebs, the edge of something. A bracket, a pipe fitting, nothing. The metal box was gone. Cade pulled his arm out, stood up, looked at the space behind the water heater with the flashlight. Saw, in the dust on the floor, the clean rectangle where something had sat for a long time and been removed recently. The outline was crisp. No dust had settled into it yet. Hours old, at most. Roy had the phone. Cade's hand went to the workbench. Not for a tool, for stability. He gripped the edge of the bench and let the weight of what had just happened settle through him. Heavy, cold, final. The evidence was gone. The phone with the names and addresses, the proof that Roy Vance was connected to something larger, the thing that could have turned a domestic violence case into a federal investigation, gone. Carried out of this garage by a man who posted $500 bail and walked into the night with the kind of smile that said he'd been planning for this moment since the first knock on his door. They were too late. Cade stood in the dark garage with rain hammering the roof and his phone light casting long shadows across the cluttered floor, and felt, for the first time since Eli walked into that diner, the specific weight of failure settling on his shoulders like a yoke. Then his light caught something. On the floor, near the water heater, partially hidden under a rag that had been kicked or dropped in the haste of removal. A piece of paper, torn, Small, maybe 3 inches by 4, ripped from something larger, a notebook or a ledger, with a jagged edge that suggested speed rather than precision. On it, in handwriting that was small and tight and eerily familiar from the county records priest had shown him at the dockside, were 3 lines. A name, an address, a number. The name was not Roy Vance. The name was not anyone Cade recognized. But the address was in this county, this town, 7 blocks from where Cade was standing. And the number, a phone number with a local area code, was one Cade had seen before, not in a file, not on a screen, on the side of a van that had been parked outside the county intake office on Mason Street when he'd walked in 45 minutes ago. A white van with a local area code and a business name painted on the side that Cade had glanced at and dismissed because it looked ordinary, because everything about this network was designed to look ordinary, because the entire architecture of what Roy Vance was part of depended on the world glancing at it and looking away. The van was at Mason Street, where the boys were. Cade's phone was in his hand before his next breath. He called Dutch. 2 rings. 3. No answer. He called Roach. The phone rang once. Roach picked up. Back of the house is clear. What did you... Get to the bikes. Now. What happened? The phone is gone. Roy was here, and there's a van at the intake office that shouldn't be there. Silence on the line. 1 second. 2. The particular silence of a man whose combat training is overriding every civilian response in his nervous system and rerouting all available resources to the single channel that matters. Action. Moving. Cade ran. Through the side yard, through the rain, boots slipping on wet grass. He reached his Harley, threw his leg over, kicked the engine. The sound shattered the quiet of Briar Lane. A thunderclap of mechanical fury that set a dog barking 3 houses down and sent a cat streaking across the road like a dark arrow. Roach was on his bike 2 seconds later. Dutch was already gone. His Harley was missing from the line. Cade hadn't heard him leave, hadn't seen him move. The man had read the situation through walls and rain and silence and was already riding toward Mason Street with the focused, terrifying efficiency of a man who did not process danger as a concept, but as a coordinate. Cade twisted the throttle. The rear tire broke traction on the wet road, caught, hooked, and launched him forward into the rain. Streetlights blurred. The world narrowed to a tunnel of water and headlight, and the sick yellow pulse of sodium lamps streaking past like tracer rounds. 7 blocks. He covered them in under 2 minutes, running every light, leaning through turns that the rain made suicidal, feeling the rear end of the softail slide on every corner, and correcting with the reflexive precision of a man who had been riding in bad conditions for 20 years and whose body understood the physics of traction the way a musician's fingers understood strings. Mason Street. The intake office. The parking lot. The white van was still there, parked at the far end of the lot, away from the building's entrance, away from the overhead lights. Engine off. Lights off. But through the rain-streaked windshield, in the faint ambient glow of the building's exterior lamp, Cade could see movement inside the cab. A figure. Maybe 2. Watching. Dutch's Harley was parked at the curb near the entrance, engine still running, the headlight cutting a cone of light through the rain that illuminated the front door of the intake office. Dutch himself was nowhere visible, which meant he was already inside the building, or already positioned somewhere that the darkness made invisible, doing what Dutch did best, existing in spaces without being seen until the moment he chose to be. Cade pulled into the lot, killed his headlight, let the engine idle low. Roach pulled in beside him, mirroring the move. Lights off, engine at a murmur, 2 dark shapes on dark machines in a dark corner of a parking lot where something was about to happen. He pulled out his phone, dialed the intake office number from the sign on the building's door. 3 rings. 4. The caseworker answered. Whitfield. Mr. Mercer? There's a white van in your parking lot, far corner. At least 1 person inside. Do you have security in the building? Silence. The sound of movement, a chair pushing back, footsteps, the creak of a blind being lifted. I see it. Lock the interior doors. Don't let anyone in or out until I tell you otherwise. Mr. Mercer, I should call the police. Call them, but lock the doors first. He hung up, pocketed the phone, looked at Roach. Roach's shaking had stopped again. His face was a mask of controlled intensity, every line sharpened, every muscle engaged, the face of a man whose nervous system had been forged in combat and was now operating at the frequency it was originally designed for. Not peace, not anger, function, pure, distilled, lethal function. What are we doing? Roach asked. Not a question about strategy, a question about limits. How far? How much? What line? Cade looked at the van, at the building where two boys sat in a room they'd been told was safe, being processed by a system they'd been told would protect them, while a vehicle full of shadows sat in the parking lot watching the door. We're not leaving, Cade said. He swung off the Harley, stood in the rain. The water ran down his face, his jacket, pooled in his boots. He didn't feel it. He was operating on a fuel that had nothing to do with warmth or comfort or the calculations of self-preservation, a fuel that burned clean and hot and came from the place in his chest where a 10-year-old boy still sat in a room waiting for someone to walk through the door. He started walking toward the van. Roach fell in beside him, shoulder to shoulder. Two men in leather crossing a rain-swept parking lot toward a vehicle that contained something they didn't fully understand, connected to a network they couldn't fully see. Driven by motives that made the domestic violence they'd interrupted tonight look like the surface of an ocean whose depth they were only now beginning to comprehend. 30 feet from the van, the engine started. The headlights hit them. High beams, blinding. Two columns of white light that turned the rain into a wall of silver needles and erased everything behind the glare. The van, the occupants, the license plate, all of it swallowed by a brightness so aggressive it felt like an act of violence. Cade didn't stop walking. 20 feet. The engine revved. The van lurched forward, not toward them, but sideways, cutting across the lot toward the exit, tires spraying water in a wide arc that caught the light and turned to diamonds. Then Dutch appeared. He stepped out from behind the dumpster at the lot's exit, a wall of shadow and leather and absolute, immovable intent. He stood in the van's path the way a boulder stands in a river's path, without negotiation, without doubt, with the simple physical authority of a mass that has decided not to move and has the density to back the decision up. The van's brakes locked, tires screamed on wet asphalt. The vehicle skidded, 4 feet, 6 feet, 8, and stopped. Close enough that Dutch could have laid his palm flat on the hood without leaning forward. He didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't blink. Rain ran down his face like a second skin, and for a moment, one long, stretched, infinite moment, the parking lot held its breath. The van's engine idling, the Harleys rumbling from the far end of the lot, the rain falling on everything with the indiscriminate patience of weather that doesn't care about human drama. And three men in leather standing in the formation they'd held for a decade, Cade at center, Roach at flank, Dutch at the point of contact, facing a vehicle that contained the connective tissue of something they'd only begun to understand. The driver's door opened. A man stepped out. Not Roy Vance. Someone else. Someone Cade had never seen. Mid-50s, gray suit under a rain jacket, clean-shaven, wire-rimmed glasses, the particular grooming of a man who existed in offices and conference rooms, and the kind of spaces where violence was conducted through paperwork and phone calls rather than fists. He looked at the three bikers with an expression that contained no fear, no surprise, no anger, only the mild, clinical irritation of a man whose schedule had been disrupted. "Gentlemen," he said, "you're making a mistake." Cade stood in the rain, 15 feet from the van, water streaming down his face, his fists at his sides, not clenched, not open, held in the particular intermediate position of a man whose hands were waiting for his brain to decide. "Who are you?" The man smiled, not Roy's smile, something colder, more professional. The smile of a man who had done this 1,000 times and found the repetition tedious. "I'm someone who can make this all go away. The charges against Roy, the custody case, the investigation that your friend with the cane is trying to start, all of it, gone by Monday morning. Those boys back with their mother. Your names out of every file. Clean. Simple." "And what do you get?" The man looked at Cade the way a collector looks at an obstacle between himself and the object behind a display case. "I get to continue my work without interference from men who don't understand what they've walked into." From behind the building, the sound of sirens. Real this time. Close. The police backup that Whitfield had called, cutting through the night toward Mason Street. The man heard them too. His expression didn't change. He reached into his jacket, slowly, deliberately, aware that three men were watching his hands with the focused attention of predators tracking movement, and produced a business card, held it out between two fingers. Think about it. You have until Monday. Kay didn't take the card. The rain hit it. The ink began to bleed. The man dropped it on the wet asphalt, stepped back into the van. The passenger, still invisible, still a shadow behind rain-streaked glass, pulled the door shut. The van reversed, swung wide, pulled out of the lot just as the first cruiser turned onto Mason Street, lights blazing, siren cutting the air. Gone. Cade stood in the rain, looking at the business card dissolving on the asphalt. The ink ran in blue rivers between his boots, carrying a name and a number into the drain grate at the edge of the lot, disappearing into the infrastructure beneath the town like everything else this network had built. Invisible, underground, flowing through channels that nobody saw because nobody looked down. But Cade had seen the name before the rain took it, and the name matched one of the three lines on the torn paper in his pocket. The fragment from Roy Vance's garage, the piece that was supposed to be gone, the scrap that had fallen in the haste of a man who thought he'd cleaned up everything and missed the one piece that mattered. The sirens arrived. The lights painted the parking lot red and blue. Officers poured out. Questions began. And Cade stood in the center of it all, soaked, exhausted, vibrating with a fury so controlled it had its own gravitational field, holding a scrap of paper in his pocket that connected a man in a gray suit to a house 7 blocks away, where, if the pattern held, another child was living inside the same silence that Eli had walked 4 miles through the snow to escape. The war wasn't coming, the war was here, and the next 12 hours would determine whether 3 broken men on motorcycles could dismantle something that had been designed, funded, and protected by people who had never once expected the threat to come wearing leather and riding thunder through the rain. The cruiser lights painted Mason Street in alternating waves of red and blue that made the rain look like it was bleeding. Cade told the officers everything. Not some of it. Not the version that protected him or softened the edges or left out the parts where 3 men with felony-adjacent records rode to a house wrapped in crime scene tape and entered a garage through an unlocked door. Everything. The diner. The boy. The walk to Briar Lane. Priest's research. The manufactured identity. The sealed investigation. The phone that was gone. The torn scrap of paper with a name and address and number that matched the man who'd just driven out of this parking lot in a white van offering to make it all disappear. He told it standing in the rain, soaked to the marrow, his voice level and unhurried, while Officer Hale, called back from the end of his shift by the dispatch that had rerouted him to Mason Street, stood with his arms crossed, and his face doing the thing faces do when the information coming in exceeds the architecture designed to process it. When Cade finished, Hale was quiet for a long time. The rain filled the silence. Behind them, the intake office windows glowed with that flat institutional light. Inside, Whitfield had locked the interior doors as instructed and was standing at the reception desk with her phone pressed to her ear, speaking rapidly to someone whose authority exceeded her own. Eli and Noah were still in the back room, safe, untouched. The van had never gotten close to the entrance, but it had been there, watching, waiting, and the boys hadn't known, and the caseworker hadn't known, and nobody would have known if Cade hadn't walked into a garage on Briar Lane and found an empty space behind a water heater where a metal box used to be. "The torn page," Hale said. "You have it on you." Cade reached into his jacket, pulled out the scrap of paper. It was damp, the ink slightly smeared, but the writing was legible. 3 lines in Roy Vance's tight, precise handwriting. A name, an address, a phone number. Hale looked at it. Didn't touch it. He pulled a plastic evidence bag from his cruiser and held it open while Cade dropped the paper inside. The bag sealed with a zip that sounded, in the quiet of the parking lot, like a door closing on something that could never be reopened casually. "This address," Hale said, 7 blocks from here. "You're saying there may be another household matching the same pattern?" "That's what the evidence suggests." "The evidence you obtained by entering a property marked as a crime scene." The garage wasn't taped. The door was unlocked. Roy had already been there. Hale looked at him. The look lasted 5 full seconds, long enough for both men to understand the legal tightrope they were standing on and the distance to the ground on either side. What Cade had done was, at best, a gray area that a sympathetic judge might overlook. At worst, it was contamination of a crime scene that a competent defense attorney could use to unravel everything. But the paper was real. The name was real. The address was real. And somewhere 7 blocks away, the pattern might be repeating in a house that looked just like number 4 and 12. Ordinary, maintained, the kind of place you drove past 1,000 times without ever feeling the wrongness beneath the surface. "I'm going to call this in," Hale said. "County detectives. State police if the county kicks it up, which they will once they see the sealed investigation flag. This is beyond my scope." "How long?" "Hours. Maybe morning. There might be a kid in that house right now." "I know." Hale's voice cracked on the second word. A hairline fracture in the professional surface that revealed, for just a moment, the human being underneath. The man who'd been answering domestic calls in this county for 20 years. The man who'd been to Briar Lane before and left. The man who carried that leaving the way Cade carried his tattoo, permanently, visibly, a word written on the body that meant something only the bearer fully understood. "I know," Hale said again, quieter, "and I'm going to handle it. But I need you to let me handle it. Because if you go to that address tonight, you, with your record, on a night when you've already been inside one crime scene, you give whoever's behind this exactly the argument they need to make all of it inadmissible. The paper. Lena's testimony. The caseworker's notes. All of it. Gone. Not because the truth doesn't matter, but because the truth has rules, and the rules don't care who broke them or why." Cade stood in the rain, felt it running down his neck, under his collar, along the channels of his body like a cold second circulatory system. He wanted to ride. Wanted to go to that address and knock on that door and do what he'd done on Briar Lane, stand on a porch and look into a dangerous man's eyes and communicate, through sheer physical presence, that the hidden world behind that door had been breached. But Hale was right, and being right was the thing that separated what happened tonight from what happened to Cade 31 years ago. The difference between a rescue that held up and a rescue that collapsed under the weight of its own good intentions, leaving the children it was supposed to save worse off than before. "Okay," Cade said. One word, the hardest word he'd said all night. Harder than the promise on the porch. Harder than the conversation with Lena in the hallway. Because this word required something Cade had never been good at. Trust in a system that had failed him, and failed Eli, and failed every child who'd ever walked 4 miles in the snow, because the system's procedures and timelines and rules didn't move fast enough to catch up with the things that happen in the dark. But Hale wasn't the system. Hale was a man who'd said, "I know," with a crack in his voice and a 20-year weight on his shoulders, and the look of someone who had just been given a chance to do the thing he'd been unable to do every other time he'd stood on a porch and left. Cade handed over the truth and trusted a stranger to carry it. The next 6 hours happened in a rhythm that Cade experienced the way a man experiences surgery. Conscious but removed, aware of the procedures being performed but unable to control them, existing in a state of enforced stillness while other hands did the work. Hale made calls. The calls generated more calls. By 2 in the morning, a county detective was at the intake office reviewing Lena's statement. By 3, a state police investigator had accessed the sealed file from 2014 and confirmed what Priest's contacts had suggested. 14 false identities. A network operating across 3 counties, an investigation that had been shut down not because it was resolved, but because a key witness had recanted and the case had collapsed from the inside. The witness who recanted was a woman, a mother, living in a household with one of the 14 men. She'd recanted because the man in her house had told her that if she testified, her children would be placed in foster care and she'd never see them again. The system's own machinery had been weaponized against itself. The threat wasn't violence, it was bureaucracy. The network understood that for a mother living on the margins, the fear of losing her children to the state was more paralyzing than any fist. Roy Vance had used the same playbook with Lena, the same quiet, calibrated architecture of control. Don't hit where teachers see. Don't leave marks where cameras reach, and always maintain the implicit threat. If you talk, they'll take your kids, and you'll have nothing. But Lena had talked. Standing in the snow on Briar Lane, wearing a bathrobe, shaking with a cold that came from deeper than weather, she had dismantled 2 years of silence in a single conversation with Officer Hale. And in the hallway of the intake office, She had given Cade the location of the phone, and the phone that Roy had taken from the garage, the phone that was supposed to be the network's insurance policy, was now the network's liability, because Roy Vance was carrying a device full of names and addresses and the digital fingerprints of every connection the network had built. And the state police knew it existed, and a warrant was being drafted at 4 in the morning by a judge who'd been woken from sleep and told that the sealed investigation from 2014 was no longer sealed. At 4:30, Hale came to the waiting room where Cade, Roach, and Dutch sat in plastic chairs that had become, over the course of the night, as familiar as their own motorcycle seats. "We picked up Roy Vance 40 minutes ago. Motel outside Ridgemont. He had the phone." Cade closed his eyes. Just for a moment. A single bead of darkness behind his eyelids, where the tension he'd been carrying for 8 hours released by a fraction. Not all the way, not completely, but enough that his shoulders dropped a quarter inch and his hands unclenched for the first time since he'd found the empty space behind the water heater. And the address? The one on the paper? State police served a warrant at 3:15. A man living there under the name Kevin Braddock, also manufactured. 2 children in the home, a girl, 9, and a boy, 6. Neither are his biological children. The mother was unaware of the false identity. Dutch made a sound, small, involuntary. A sound that came from somewhere so deep in a man who never made sounds that the room went still around it, the way a room goes still when a structure that everyone assumed was solid suddenly shows a crack. "Are they safe?" Dutch asked. 2 words. His voice raw in a way Cade had never heard from him. Not anger, something under anger. Something that lived in the basement of a man's experience where the oldest wounds were stored. "They're safe. Both children are in protective custody. The mother is cooperating." Hale paused, looked at the 3 bikers, at the leather and the scars and the road grime and the exhaustion that had turned their faces into landscapes of shadow and bone. The phone had 37 contacts. Not all of them are connected to the network. Some are legitimate, some are burners. But the state police have already identified 6 additional false identities across the Tri-County area, each one in a household with children. 6. The number sat in the waiting room like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples outward through the silence. Arrests are being coordinated now. Multiple agencies. By Monday morning, every name on that phone will have been investigated. Roach leaned back in his chair, stared at the ceiling. The fluorescent lights cast his face in that flat, colorless illumination that erased everything except the essential geometry. The deep lines, the white beard, the tremoring hands that had finally started shaking again now that the adrenaline was receding and the neurological reality was reasserting itself. "Monday morning," Roach repeated. "Yes. Margaret Harlan. I've been told she's already been in contact with the county attorney's office. She'll be representing Lena Marsden at the custody hearing." Cade opened his eyes, looked at Hale. "You did this. We did this. All of us." Hale's jaw worked. The professional mask was still there, but it was thinner now, worn down by a night that had peeled back every layer of institutional distance he'd spent 20 years constructing. "You were right. About what you said in the snow. About what that boy did. About what it means when a child walks 4 miles past every institution that's supposed to protect him and ends up asking a stranger in a leather jacket for help." He reached into his pocket, pulled out a card, his own, not the dissolving one from the parking lot, held it out. "If those boys need anything, if Lena needs anything, my direct line." Cade took the card, put it in his jacket beside the pocket where the torn scrap of paper had been. The pocket was empty now. The evidence was in the system that had failed, that had been weaponized, that had sealed an investigation and let 14 men continue operating inside its blind spots. But the system was also the thing that was arresting those men now, serving warrants now, pulling children out of houses now. The same machine that broke things was the machine that fixed them. The same architecture that hid damage was the architecture that, when it worked, prevented it. The contradiction was unbearable, and it was the truth. Dawn came slow. Not the dramatic kind. No golden light breaking through clouds. No cinematic sunrise painting the world in warm colors. Midwest dawn in winter was a gradual, grudging concession. The sky went from black to dark gray to lighter gray, the way a bruise fades. Not healing, exactly, but changing. The rain stopped sometime around 5:30. The clouds stayed. The temperature dropped 3 more degrees, and the wet streets began to freeze in patterns that caught the first light and held it like glass holding an image. Cade walked out of the intake office at 6:14 in the morning. The parking lot was nearly empty. The cruisers were gone. Whitfield's sedan was gone. The space where the white van had been was just a rectangle of wet asphalt, unremarkable, identical to every other rectangle in the lot. The evidence of what had happened here was already being absorbed by the ordinary, the world's relentless ability to process extraordinary events and render them invisible within hours. Roach and Dutch were already at the bikes. Roach sat on his Road King with his helmet on his knee and his unlit cigarette, the same one, still behind his ear, a 12-hour companion, finally between his lips. Dutch stood beside his Harley with both hands resting on the handlebars, looking east, toward the place where the sun would be if the clouds ever broke. Cade stood between them. 3 men in a parking lot at dawn, leather jackets stiff with dried rain, faces gray with exhaustion, standing beside machines that had carried them through a night that none of them had planned for and all of them would carry for the rest of their lives. "Breakfast," Roach said. "Yeah." "Max?" "Where else?" They rode. Slowly. No urgency. No formation. 3 machines moving through empty streets at the speed of men who had nowhere to be and everywhere to process. The engines rumbled low, not the aggressive territorial thunder of the night before, but something quieter, conversational. The sound of machines and men both running on fumes, burning the last reserves of a fuel that was part gasoline and part something else entirely. The diner appeared through the morning mist like a memory materializing, the battered aluminum siding, the missing letters above the door, the one surviving neon sign now dark in the daylight, its tubes cold and colorless. The parking lot was empty except for Doris's ancient Buick, parked in the same spot it occupied every morning at 5:30 when she arrived to start the coffee and turn on the grill and open the door to a building that the county had condemned and the world had forgotten, and the people who needed it kept coming back to anyway. They parked, killed the engines. The silence that followed was different from every other silence of the night. Not tense, not charged, not the silence of men waiting for something to happen. This was the silence of aftermath, the vast, hollowed-out quiet that exists in the space a storm leaves behind. Cade dismounted. His legs were stiff. His back ached from 12 hours on a motorcycle seat in freezing weather. His hands, when he pulled off his gloves, were red and swollen, the knuckles cracked from cold, the skin so tight it felt like it belonged to someone else. He walked to the door, pushed it open. The smell hit him first, coffee, fresh and hot, the particular dark roasted intensity that Doris achieved by using twice the grounds any reasonable person would, and brewing it in a machine that was older than some of her customers. Beneath the coffee, bacon grease, toast, the warm mineral smell of a gas stove burning, and the ancient embedded aroma of 10,000 cigarettes smoked in a room that had never been properly ventilated. Doris was behind the counter, 73 years old, cigarette burning in the cracked ceramic ashtray. Her face, when she looked up and saw the 3 of them standing in the doorway, wet, wrecked, alive, did something that Cade didn't expect and couldn't have prepared for. She smiled. Not a big smile. Not a performance. A small private expression that lived mostly in her eyes and said, without words, that she'd been waiting, that she'd made the coffee strong on purpose, that the booth in this corner, their booth, the one with the cracked vinyl and the view of the parking lot, was clean and warm and waiting the way it always was, because some things in this broken world remained constant, not through luck but through the stubborn daily choice of people who decided that consistency was its own form of love. 3? She asked. 3. She poured the coffee before they sat down. 3 mugs, black, set on the counter with the quiet precision of a woman who understood that some mornings the only thing standing between a man and his undoing was a hot cup of something bitter that somebody else made for him. Cade sat, Roach sat, Dutch sat. For a long time nobody spoke. The coffee steamed, the bacon sizzled on the grill. Outside, the morning light strengthened by fractions, the gray sky brightening almost imperceptibly, the way hope brightens. Not in revelations, but in increments so small. You only notice them when you look back and realize the world is slightly less dark than it was an hour ago. Roach broke the silence. You know what Priest is going to say? Yeah. He's going to say we're in this now, long term, court dates, testimonies, background checks that'll make us look like exactly the kind of people a judge doesn't want near children. I know. He's going to say Margaret Harlan is expensive and difficult and doesn't like bikers, and we're going to have to sit in rooms with people who look at us the way Drummond looked at us on that porch. I know. And you're going to do it anyway. Cade looked at his coffee, at the dark surface reflecting the fluorescent lights, the tiny ripples from the vibration of the grill, the steam rising and disappearing into air that smelled like everything he'd ever needed in one place: warmth, caffeine, grease, and the presence of men who'd ridden through the worst night of his recent life without once asking him to explain why it mattered. Yeah, he said. I am. Roach nodded, picked up his mug, took a sip, set it down. Then, with the casual deliberateness of a man making a decision he'd already made hours ago and was only now allowing to surface, he said, Then so am I. Dutch said nothing, but he reached for the sugar dispenser, the only man among them who took sugar, and added 2 spoonfuls to his coffee with the careful, methodical movements of someone who intended to be sitting in this seat for a long time. That was his answer. The diner filled slowly as morning deepened. A truck driver. 2 women in scrubs coming off a hospital shift. An old man with a newspaper who sat at the counter and ordered the same thing he'd been ordering since the letters above the door still spelled whatever name they'd once spelled. Nobody looked twice at the bikers. In this diner, in this town, leather jackets and scarred knuckles and the smell of road and rain were as unremarkable as the drop ceiling tiles and the broken neon. You didn't come to Max to be seen. You came to be left alone with your coffee and your damage and the particular mercy of a place that expected nothing from you except that you pay your tab and not start any trouble. Cade's phone buzzed at 7:08, a text from a number he didn't recognize. He opened it. It was from Whitfield, the caseworker. 4 words that carried more weight than the legal paragraphs and procedural language that would follow in the days and weeks and months ahead. Boys are asking for you. Cade read it again, set the phone on the table, screen up, so Roach and Dutch could see. Roach looked at it. His eyes went bright. Not tears, because Dennis Kowalski didn't cry. Hadn't cried since Fallujah. Had rebuilt his entire emotional infrastructure around the principle that certain valves, once opened, could never be closed again. But the brightness was there. Visible. Real. The wet shine of a man whose body was trying to express something his discipline wouldn't allow. Dutch read the 4 words and did something Cade had never seen him do in 11 years of writing together. He laughed. A single short exhale through his nose, barely audible, easily missed. But it was there. A sound so rare and so unexpected that Roach turned and stared at him the way you'd stare at a statue that suddenly blinked. What? Dutch said. Nothing, Roach said. Absolutely nothing. Cade picked up his phone, typed a reply. 6 words. Tell them when we're on our way. He put the phone away, finished his coffee, set the mug down on the counter with a quiet final sound. Porcelain on formica, the period at the end of a sentence that had been writing itself since a boy walked through a diner door 8 hours ago and asked a room full of broken men where the police station was. He left a 50 on the counter. Doris would argue about it. She always did. He'd tell her the same thing he always told her, so keep it, you earned it, the coffee alone was worth 20. And she'd shake her head and put the bill in her apron pocket and add it to the envelope she kept in the register for what she called rainy day money, which was a joke in a diner that had survived more rainy days than anyone could count. Outside, the morning air was cold and clean. The rain had washed everything, the parking lot, the road, the sky itself, and left behind a world that looked, if not new, then at least rinsed, scrubbed, given a temporary reprieve from the grime and exhaustion that would inevitably return, but hadn't yet. 3 Harleys sat in the lot, chrome catching the weak morning light, seats dark with residual moisture, engines cold, waiting. Cade threw his leg over the softail. The leather seat was stiff beneath him. He gripped the handlebars, the rubber worn smooth from a decade of his hands in exactly this position, and felt the particular alignment that happened when a man sat on a machine that had carried him through enough miles to circle something and came out the other side still moving. He kicked the engine. It caught. The sound filled the parking lot, deep, steady, the bass note of a machine that didn't care about the night behind it or the road ahead, but simply ran, reliably, with the mechanical indifference that Cade had always found more trustworthy than human promises. Roach started his Road King. Dutch started his Dyna. 3 engines, 3 heartbeats, 3 columns of exhaust rising into the cold morning air and dissolving into a sky that was, if you looked carefully, beginning to show the faintest trace of blue behind the gray. They pulled out of the lot. Cade at point, Roach right, Dutch left. The formation was automatic. Not a decision, not a strategy, but the muscle memory of men who had been moving together so long that their bodies understood the geometry of proximity and trust without conscious instruction. The road to Ridgemont was 30 miles of county highway that cut through flat farmland and bare tree woodlots, and the occasional small town that existed primarily as a speed limit change and a gas station. Cade rode with his visor up. The cold air hit his face like a hand pressing flat against his skin. Not gentle, not cruel, just present. Real. The kind of sensation that reminded a man he was alive not through comfort, but through contact. He thought about Eli, about the boy's stillness in the diner, the careful distance on the back of the motorcycle, fingers gripping the seat rail, not the rider. The posture of a child who had learned that proximity to other people was a risk calculation, not a comfort. He thought about Noah, 7 years old, pale in the doorway, flinching at a touch that should have been safe. He thought about Lena standing on the porch in a bathrobe, gripping the wall with both hands, and the 12 feet between the hallway and the front door that was the longest distance she'd ever crossed. He thought about the 37 contacts on Roy Vance's phone, about the 6 additional false identities already found, about the houses, the children, the mothers, an architecture of exploitation so quietly constructed that it had operated for years inside the blind spots of the very systems designed to prevent it. And he thought about Hale, about the crack in the officer's voice when he said, "I know," about the card in Cade's pocket, about the 20 years of domestic calls that had built up inside the man like sediment in a river, layer after layer of things he'd seen and couldn't fix, until one night a biker with a criminal record stood in the snow and said the words that cracked the sediment open and let the current through. The road stretched ahead, flat, gray, ordinary. The kind of road that looked like it went nowhere until you'd been riding it long enough to realize it went everywhere, through towns and counties, and the invisible borders between the world people saw and the world that existed underneath, where the real architecture lived, where the real decisions were made, where children waited in rooms for someone to walk through the door. 30 miles. Cade rode them the way he rode everything, slowly enough to see, fast enough to matter. Behind him, his brothers rode in silence. The engines spoke for them, a rolling, steady conversation in a language that didn't need translation. The language of machines and men and the road between, carrying 3 scarred, imperfect, unreasonable human beings toward a building where 2 boys were waiting because they'd asked, and because asking was the bravest thing either of them had ever done, and because the men they'd asked were the kind of men the world looked at and saw danger, but who carried, underneath the leather and the scars and the records, the one thing that mattered more than any system or institution or procedure ever built. They showed up. The Ridgemont facility was a low brick building set back from the road behind a chain-link fence with a security gate. Functional, clean, the kind of place designed not to impress but to contain, to provide walls and warmth and locked doors between the children inside and the world outside that had already proven itself untrustworthy. Cade parked at the gate, killed the engine, sat for a moment in the sudden quiet, feeling the vibration leave his hands and the cold settle back into his bones, and the weight of the night pressing down on him with a gravity that was for the first time not crushing but settling. The way sediment settles after a storm, the way the world settles after it's been shaken hard enough to rearrange everything and is now finding its new shape. He dismounted, walked to the gate, pressed the intercom. "Cade Mercer. I was told the Marsden boys are asking for me." A pause. A buzz. The gate clicked open. He walked through. Behind him, Roach and Dutch stayed at the bikes. Not because they weren't welcome, because they understood. The way only men who had spent their lives navigating the precise mathematics of when to stand close and when to stand back could understand. That some doors a man needed to walk through alone. The intake coordinator met him in the lobby, young, kind-faced, The expression of someone who worked with damaged children and had learned to carry their damage without letting it become her own. A balance that Cade recognized as one of the most difficult acts of emotional engineering a human being could perform. They're in the activity room. Eli's been up since 5. Noah slept through. How are they? She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Eli is quiet, controlled. The way he's been, I think, for a long time. Noah is fragile. But he ate breakfast. All of it. That's a good sign. She led him down a hallway that smelled like disinfectant and crayons. Stopped at a door with a small window. Through it, Cade could see a room with child-sized tables and chairs and shelves of books, and a carpet printed with a map of something that was meant to be educational. Noah sat at one of the tables with a coloring book, working with the careful, focused intensity of a child who had discovered that the world inside the lines was controllable in a way the world outside them never had been. Eli sat by the window, not coloring, not reading, just sitting, his body angled toward the glass, watching the parking lot with the same radar he'd been running all night, scanning, monitoring, waiting for the shape on the horizon to resolve into something identifiable. When Cade stepped through the door, Eli turned. Their eyes met. And something happened in that room. Something that didn't have a name in any language Cade knew. Something that existed in the frequency between two people who recognized each other, not by face or voice, but by damage. The boy who'd walked 4 miles. The man who'd been that boy 31 years ago. 2 versions of the same wound, separated by decades and miles, and the accumulation of everything that happens between the age of 10 and the age of 41, looking at each other across a room full of small chairs and coloring books, and the quiet, stubborn proof that the world, for all its machinery of failure, sometimes delivered the right person to the right door at the right moment. Eli didn't run, didn't cry, didn't perform the kind of dramatic reunion that movies use to signal emotional resolution. He stood up, walked across the room, stopped 2 feet from Cade, and looked up at him with those dark, watchful eyes that had been scanning for danger since before he knew the word for it. "You came back," Eli said. Not a question, a confirmation. The verbal equivalent of a hand reaching out and touching something solid to verify that it was real. "Yeah," Cade said. "Are you going to keep coming back?" The question landed in Cade's chest like a fist, not violent, but precise, hitting the exact place where 31 years of unanswered questions lived. The place where a 10-year-old boy still sat in a room, waiting. Cade crouched down. Not to be at eye level. Eli was almost tall enough that crouching wasn't necessary, but because the posture mattered, because looking up at someone was different from looking across at them, and Cade wanted this boy to see his face from a position that didn't require tilting his head back, that didn't reproduce the geometry of every adult who'd ever stood over him and made promises from a height. "Yeah," Cade said. "I am." Eli studied his face, reading it the way he'd read every face that night, carefully, skeptically, with the cold arithmetic of a child who'd been bankrupt on trust for years. But something was different now. The calculation was still running, the radar was still spinning, but underneath it, underneath the fear and the vigilance and the 10-year-old architecture of self-protection, something small and green was pushing through the surface. Not trust. Not yet. Trust was a thing that grew slowly, in soil that had been burned, from seeds that took a long time to believe the fire was out. But the willingness to wait and see if trust might grow, the decision not to close the door all the way, the hairline crack in the wall that let in just enough light to suggest that the darkness on the other side wasn't permanent. Eli nodded once, a small motion, then turned and walked back to the window and sat down. But this time, he didn't watch the parking lot. He watched Cade. And Cade sat down in one of the small chairs, too small for him, absurdly small, his knees nearly touching his chest, and stayed. Outside, the morning continued its slow, reluctant brightening. Roach smoked his cigarette. Finally, 12 hours after it had first appeared behind his ear, the flame from his lighter cupped against the wind, the first inhale deep and slow, and carrying with it the accumulated tension of a night that had tested every remaining structure in his body and mind. Dutch stood beside his Harley, arms crossed, face turned toward the facility, watching the building with the same patient, immovable attention he'd given the intake office on Mason Street. Not guarding, witnessing, Standing in the cold, because standing in the cold was what you did when someone you'd ridden with walked through a door that mattered, and you wanted them to know, when they came back out, that the road was still there, and the engine was still warm, and the brothers were still waiting. The clouds shifted. A thin line of blue appeared along the eastern horizon, narrow, fragile, barely visible. The kind of blue that could close up again in a minute, or could, if the wind was right, widen slowly into something that resembled, if not a clear sky, then at least the promise that clear skies existed somewhere behind the gray. Inside the facility, Noah looked up from his coloring book, saw Cade sitting in the small chair, looked at Eli, looked back at Cade. Then he picked up a crayon, blue, the same blue as the line on the horizon, and went back to coloring. The room was warm, the light was soft, and 3 miles down the road, in a diner with no name, Doris poured coffee for the morning regulars and tucked a $50 bill into the envelope in the register, and couldn't know, that the money had been left by a man who'd spent the night proving that the most dangerous thing in the world isn't violence or conspiracy or the machinery of systems that fail. The most dangerous thing in the world is a man with nothing left to lose who decides that someone else's child is worth everything he has. Some people survive because the law saves them. Some people survive because the system, for all its cracks, holds just long enough. And some people survive because 3 men on motorcycles, scarred, broken, carrying invisible wars inside them, heard a boy ask for help and decided, without a vote, without a discussion, without a single word spoken aloud, that the answer was yes, always yes.